Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The night was warm, the kind that made the air feel thick, pressing down on everything. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting long, pale shadows on the pavement. My parents were driving home from dinner, just taking their time. They weren't in a rush. The roads were mostly empty, and the hum of the engine was the only sound inside the car. They reached a four-way stop and slowed down behind another vehicle, a small sedan. It was dark, but they could see the silhouettes of two people inside, both young women, chatting, moving slightly as they spoke. The driver paused, checking both ways, then started to turn left. That's when the truck appeared. It wasn't slowing down. It wasn't stopping. It was moving fast, too fast. In an instant, it was there, in the middle of the intersection, plowing through the stop sign without hesitation. My parents barely had time to process it before the impact came. A sickening crunch. A sound so loud it punched through the night. The kind of noise that doesn't just hit your ears but rattles something deep inside you. The truck slammed into the sedan's side, right where the passenger sat. The force was brutal, crushing metal, shattering glass, twisting the frame like paper. The sedan lurched sideways, lifted slightly from the ground, then came crashing back down in a heap of crumpled steel and broken glass. Pieces of the car scattered across the asphalt, skidding and spinning before coming to a stop in the quiet that followed. The truck barely seemed affected. It rocked back from the force of the crash, then settled. Its engine was still running, idling like nothing had happened. For a second, no one moved. Then my parents did. My dad threw the car into park, and they rushed out, their feet pounding against the pavement. My mom, a nurse, was already shifting into the mindset she knew too well: assess, stabilize, act. But as they got closer, the reality of what had just happened hit them. The car was ruined. The entire side had caved in, the door crushed inward like a kicked-in tin can. The windshield had shattered, cracks webbing out from the point of impact. Glass glittered on the ground, catching the glow of the streetlights. The air smelled sharp, a mix of burnt rubber, leaking fluids, and something metallic, blood. Inside, the two women weren't moving. My mom yanked the driver's door open, her hands shaking but steady. The driver slumped slightly to the side, her head tilted awkwardly. Blood streaked her face, her hair matted with it. My mom pressed two fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. There was nothing. She was gone. The passenger, though, she was still breathing. Barely. Her chest rose and fell in weak, uneven movements. Her eyes fluttered, unfocused. There was too much blood, dark and pooling around her, soaking into the seat, dripping onto the pavement below. Then my dad saw it, the liquid spilling from her head, clear but tinged with red. "What is that?" he asked. And my mom, already pressing her hands to the wound, trying to do something, anything, to keep this girl here, had to answer. It was brain fluid. The girl's skull had split open on impact. The wound was too big, too deep. My mom tried to keep pressure on it, tried to hold everything together, but it was a battle she couldn't win. Her hands were covered in blood, warm and sticky. She was saying things she'd been trained to say in moments like this, things meant to soothe, to comfort, but she knew this girl wasn't going to make it. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, flashing red and blue against the wreckage. The ambulance pulled up fast, tires screeching as it stopped. Paramedics jumped out, rushing over with equipment, taking over. My mom stepped back, her hands shaking. She watched as they worked, moving quickly, efficiently, but the outcome was already written. They loaded the girl onto a stretcher, securing her, but the movements lacked urgency now. They knew. The doors slammed shut. The ambulance pulled away, its lights still flashing, but there was no rush anymore. She was gone before they even reached the hospital. The drunk driver, though, he was just standing there. Not a scratch on him, not even a limp. He swayed slightly, blinking slow, unfocused. My dad could smell it from a few feet away, the thick stench of alcohol clinging to him. His truck sat there, barely damaged compared to the sedan, its front end crumpled slightly, but nothing like the destruction it had caused. And the worst part, he wasn't panicked. He wasn't horrified. He just stood there, looking at the scene like he wasn't part of it. The cops arrived, questioning people, gathering statements. My parents told them everything. The truck had run the stop sign. The guy had been speeding. He was clearly drunk. It wasn't a question of what happened. It was obvious. But things didn't go the way they should have. He was arrested, sure, but not for long. He had connections. People in the force knew him, or knew his family, or owed them favors. Whatever it was, it worked. The legal process dragged on, but in the end, he got off with barely anything. A slap on the wrist for taking 2 lives. A fine, a short suspension, nothing that matched the weight of what he had done. The families of the victims were devastated and desperate. A few weeks later, my parents heard a knock at the door. When they answered, it was the family of the passenger, the girl who had died in the ambulance. They looked exhausted, hollowed out by grief. They needed help. They weren't suing the drunk driver. They were suing the family of the driver, the other victim. They needed money, and they saw an opportunity. It didn't matter that their daughter had been just as much a victim as the girl behind the wheel. They wanted someone to pay, and they were willing to drag another grieving family through hell to get it. They asked my parents to testify, to stand in court and say something that could help them win. My parents refused. They had seen too much already. They had done everything they could that night. They weren't going to be part of tearing apart 2 families that had already lost too much. The case went on without them. They never found out what happened in the end, if the lawsuit went through, if the other family had to pay. They didn't want to know, but they never forgot. Even years later, they still remembered the smell of blood in the warm night air, the sound of the impact, the way the truck's engine kept running like nothing had happened, and the way the girl's breathing had slowed, then stopped, as my mom held her broken skull together, knowing she couldn't save her. It was one of those moments that never really leaves you. The first few months in Los Angeles felt like a fog. Everything was big, fast, and unfamiliar. The city was loud, full of life, but it was the kind of life that moved past you, not with you. I had come from a small town in Mexico where everyone knew each other, where neighbors looked out for one another, and where I had never felt truly alone. But here, in this place, I felt like I was invisible. I had no family, no friends, just a small apartment, a job cleaning hotel rooms at the Omni, and the weight of uncertainty pressing on my shoulders every day. I worked long hours, scrubbing bathrooms, changing sheets, and vacuuming endless hallways of that hotel. It was exhausting, but it was steady work. The other women at the job were friendly enough, but they had their own lives, their own families to go home to. I was just another face in the break room. That's why when I met her, I let my guard down. She worked at the hotel too, doing the same job as me. She was outgoing, always laughing, always full of energy. She was one of those people who made you feel important when they spoke to you, as if you mattered. She noticed when I was feeling down, when I was tired, when I was lonely. She started sitting with me at lunch, asking about my life, offering advice, and telling me about the city. She knew Los Angeles in a way I didn't. She took me places I never would have gone on my own, markets, restaurants, little hidden spots she claimed only locals knew about. She showed me how to navigate the buses, what streets to avoid at night, which stores had the best sales. She even helped me with my English, correcting me when I made mistakes. For the first time since I arrived, I had someone to talk to laugh with. But there were red flags. Things I ignored because I didn't want to see them. She stole. Not just little things, gum or candy from a store. She took whatever she could get away with. Makeup, clothes, perfume. She'd slip things into her bag so easily, so casually, like it was nothing. Sometimes she'd even steal from the hotel, stuffing towels or small decorations into her purse. Once, I noticed my own things disappearing. A bracelet my mother had given me, a bottle of perfume I had saved up to buy. I had a feeling she had taken them, but I never confronted her. I told myself I had misplaced them, that maybe I had lost them at work. I should have said something. And then there was her boyfriend. The first time I met him, I got a bad feeling. He was one of those men who took up too much space, even when he wasn't moving. He had this way of looking at me that made my skin crawl, like he was sizing me up, deciding something in his head. He barely spoke to me, but when he did, it was short, dismissive, like I wasn't worth his time. But the way he stared, that was enough to make me uneasy. I tried to keep my distance, but they were always together. If I spent time with her, he was usually there too. He made crude jokes, talked about things I had no interest in, and always had this smug look on his face, like he was above everyone else. I hated being around him, but she acted like he was the best thing that had ever happened to her. She told me he had been in trouble before. Small things, she said. Just dumb mistakes. I later found out he had been involved in a few robberies, but had never been caught. And he always carried a gun. I should have stopped hanging out with her then. But I didn't, because she made me feel less alone. One night, she invited me out for dinner. It wasn't unusual. We had gone out before, usually just to grab food after work or walk around the city. She said her boyfriend was coming too. I didn't like that, but I told myself it was fine. I couldn't say no without looking rude. We went to a small restaurant, one of those places that wasn't fancy, but had good food. The kind of place she always seemed to know about. We ate, we talked, everything felt normal. Her boyfriend barely spoke to me, which was fine. I preferred it that way. He was more focused on her, on whispering things in her ear and making her laugh. After dinner, we drove around for a while. Just talking, listening to music, watching the lights of the city blur past. It was late, but I wasn't worried. She had done this before, taken me on long drives just to show me parts of the city. Eventually, she suggested getting donuts. We pulled into a parking lot near a small donut shop. It wasn't busy, just a few cars, the glow of the streetlights making everything look yellow. She got out, said she would get the donuts, and left me alone in the car with her boyfriend. At first, it was silent. I stared out the window, watching her walk toward the shop, waiting for her to come back. Then he spoke. I don't want to remember the things he said, but I remember his hand on my leg. I remember the way his voice changed, the way he leaned closer, how calm he was, like this was something he had done before. I froze. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I just sat there, unable to move, unable to think. Then I heard her laugh. The door opened, and she was standing there with a bag of donuts in her hand, smiling like nothing was wrong. Like she had expected this. She told me to calm down. Like I was overreacting. That was the moment I knew. She wasn't my friend. She had never been my friend. I pushed him away and got out of the car. My legs felt weak, my whole body shaking. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. I started walking, then running. I could hear them laughing behind me. I ran through the streets, through the empty sidewalks of downtown Los Angeles, past buildings that all looked the same. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. I don't know how long I ran before I finally stopped. I was out of breath, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I had no idea where I was. I was just standing there, alone, in the middle of a city that didn't care if I disappeared. I found my way home eventually. I locked my door. I didn't sleep. The next day, I went to work, afraid she would be there, that she would act like nothing had happened. But she never came back. I never saw her again. I moved a few weeks later. I found a new apartment, a smaller one, farther from where I had been. For a long time, I was afraid. Afraid I would run into them, that they would come looking for me. But they never did. I realized then that I had been nothing to them. Just something to use, to throw away when they were done. I had wanted so badly to believe that I had found a friend, that someone had cared. But in the end, I was alone, and I was better off that way. I grew up hearing stories of things that happened before my time, whispered among adults when they thought no children were listening. Some of these stories were meant to teach lessons, warnings about trusting the wrong people or the dangers of the world. But this story, the one about my relatives, was never spoken of lightly. It was a wound too deep to fully heal, a scar on the memory of those who lived to remember. It happened in the late 70s or early 80s in a wealthy home in Pakistan. A large house, the kind with sprawling rooms and cool marble floors, the kind that smelled of old wood and incense, with courtyards where the sun baked the earth in the day and the night air carried distant calls to prayer. The family was well off, respected, comfortable in their lives. They had worked hard to build their fortune, and though they were not boastful, their wealth was evident in the heavy gold jewelry the women wore, the intricate wooden furniture, and the delicate china that filled the cabinets. With such wealth came the need for servants, and they had many. Some had been with the family for decades, their presence so constant that they were considered part of the household. One in particular had been there the longest, an older man who had started working for them as a young man himself. He had watched the children of the house grow up, had served food at weddings, had been there in times of sickness and celebration alike. They trusted him the way one trusts family. That trust was their mistake. No one knows exactly how long he had been planning it. Maybe it was months, maybe years. Maybe the opportunity simply presented itself one night, and he took it. What is certain is that he knew the house inside and out. He knew where the jewelry was kept, which drawers held stacks of cash, where the gold bangles and necklaces lay tucked away in soft velvet cases. He knew which locks were sturdy and which ones could be forced open. He also knew the habits of the household, the times they prayed, when they retired for the night, which rooms would be occupied, and which ones would be empty. On that night, the air was thick with the lingering heat of the day, the walls still warm from the sun. The household had settled into its usual rhythm. Some of the family members were asleep, others in their rooms talking quietly. A few of the servants remained awake, finishing their tasks before retreating to their own quarters. The house was alive with the ordinary sounds of the night, the creak of the wooden doors, the muffled laughter of children, the distant clatter of utensils being put away. No one heard the intruders enter. They came in silence, led by the man who had once been their most trusted servant. He walked them through the corridors as if he still belonged there, as if he were still one of them. He knew which doors would be unlocked, which windows could be pried open without making too much noise. One by one, they moved through the house, cutting through the stillness of the night like shadows. The attack was sudden, methodical. The family barely had time to react before they were overpowered. Hands clamped over mouths, ropes dug into wrists. Those who struggled were struck down swiftly, the sound of fists against flesh muffled by the sheer weight of fear pressing down on the house. No one was spared, not the children, not the elders, not the servants who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were bound and dragged into the main hall, their backs pressed against the cool marble floor. The thieves worked quickly, overturning cabinets, pulling drawers from dressers, smashing locks open with the butts of their rifles. Gold, money, anything of value was taken. The women's wrists and necks were stripped of their jewelry, their bangles snapped off their arms, the sound of breaking glass echoing through the halls as cupboards were shattered. The man they had once trusted stood among the thieves, his face unreadable, his hands steady as he pointed out where the most valuable things were kept. Perhaps, for a brief moment, some of them believed that it would end there, that the thieves would take what they wanted and leave, that they would be bruised, shaken, but alive. But the thieves had other plans. No one knows why they made the decision to kill. Maybe they feared being recognized, maybe they wanted no loose ends, or maybe it was always part of the plan. Whatever the reason, there was no hesitation. The killings were brutal, efficient. The kind of violence that is neither hurried nor hesitant, but carried out with chilling precision. The family members were beheaded, their lifeless bodies slumping to the floor one after another, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. The few servants who had been in the house that night met the same fate. And then, as quickly as they had come, the thieves disappeared. By the time the house was discovered the next morning, it was eerily quiet, the once lively home reduced to a mausoleum. Blood had dried on the marble floors, soaking into the intricate patterns like an ink stain that could never be scrubbed away. The bodies lay where they had fallen, the severed heads placed grotesquely nearby, eyes staring at nothing. It was my great-uncle who had to put them back together. The custom was to present the dead as whole as possible for burial. He was the one who had to lift each head, press it back onto its body, arrange the limbs, clean what he could. He worked in silence, his hands steady even as his mind screamed. He did it because it had to be done, because the dead deserved dignity, even after such horror. The killers were never caught. The servant who had betrayed them disappeared that night, vanishing into the world as if he had never existed. Maybe he was killed by his own accomplices. Maybe he started a new life somewhere far away, his pockets lined with stolen wealth. No one knows. The house was never the same. Though new people moved in, there were always whispers of what had happened there. Servants refused to work in certain rooms. Guests spoke of a heaviness in the air, a silence that felt unnatural. And those who remembered, those who had lost their loved ones that night, never truly found peace. Some betrayals are too deep to forgive. Some wounds never heal. And some houses, no matter how grand, can never wash away the stains of what was done inside their walls. I never talked about this before. Not to my parents. Not to my friends. I buried it deep, let it collect dust in the back of my mind, convincing myself that time and distance had made it irrelevant. But I was wrong. I was wrong because I can feel it again. And I don't mean in some vague, unsettling way. I mean physically, like pressure against my skin, like heat without a source. Like when you're in a dark room and you just know someone else is standing there, even though you can't see them. The last time I felt this was when I was a kid. I grew up in a townhouse built on land with a history so ugly it seeped into the ground itself. Lee Masters, a name whispered among the locals, spoken in the kind of hushed, uneasy tone reserved for things best left buried. The landowner, the tyrant, the man who used his slaves in the worst ways imaginable and then burned their bodies to erase the evidence. The stories sounded like myths at first. I didn't want to believe them. But when I was older, I worked at the archaeological dig that unearthed the limestone furnace where he disposed of them. I saw the bones, human bones, burned beyond recognition, proof of something so monstrous that even the soil itself seemed tainted by it. And I lived there. As a kid, I chalked up my unease to normal childhood fears. The dark, the unknown, the shadows in the corner of your room that seem to move when you aren't looking directly at them. But it was more than that. I hated being alone. The air in the house felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. My bedroom and the basement were the worst. I used to wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, convinced I wasn't alone. I would lie there, staring into the dark, feeling something there, just beyond my vision waiting. It wasn't just me. My brother, who isn't sensitive the way I am, felt it too. We heard things, footsteps, scratching at our doors at night, heavy breathing, as if something was crouched outside our room, just beyond the threshold. At first, we tried to ignore it. Then we started locking our doors. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night, I had the same one. I would stand at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the blackness below. And then, without hesitation, I would jump. I would land, climb back up, and do it again, over and over, until I woke up, heart pounding, sweat soaking my sheets. I told myself it was just a dream, that I was sleepwalking maybe. But I was never hurt, and the basement stairs were steep. If I had really been jumping, I should have broken something. As I got older, it got worse. Lights flickered. The TV would cut out for no reason, then turn back on the moment we got up to check it. Doors opened and closed without explanation, and I started seeing things. Not directly, never directly, but out of the corner of my eye. Dark shapes moving where nothing should be moving. I would turn my head, and there would be nothing there. And then there was the feeling. It wasn't just unease. It was the certainty that something wanted to hurt me. The air would grow heavy, and I would feel this overwhelming sense of hostility, like something was right in front of me, staring me down, willing me to break. One night, I think I had a seizure. I was around 9 or 10. I remember lying in bed, paralyzed, my body stiff as stone, my vision swimming. I don't know how long it lasted, but when it was over, I could barely move. I told no one. My brother and I stopped talking about it after a while. He hated when I brought it up. I think it scared him more than he wanted to admit. When we moved, I thought it would end. We didn't move because of the house. The divorce between my parents was messy, violent. We left for practical reasons. The new house was across the city, still on Master's land, but farther from his estate. And for a while, things felt better. The feeling never disappeared entirely, but it wasn't constant anymore. It wasn't pressing against me every second of every day. Sometimes things still happened. Lights turning on and off. Small objects going missing. But the weight, the sheer, suffocating presence had lifted. The further I moved from that land, the more I let myself forget. I buried it, let it fade into memory. It wasn't real, I told myself. It was just my imagination. And then we moved into the apartment. The woman who lived here before me died of an opioid overdose. She was alone for 3 days before anyone found her. Her dog had to eat her face to survive. I knew none of this when we moved in, but the moment I stepped through the door, I felt it. Not the same thing. Not the same weight, the same pressing, hostile force. But something. A presence lingering. I ignored it. I ghost hunted for a year in college. I know the rules. Acknowledge it, and it will grow stronger. Feed it, and it will take more. My wife didn't know what I was feeling, but one night, she spoke to the woman. She thanked her for the apartment, told her to move on. I never told her what I felt. She never told me she spoke to her. But that same night, our dog went crazy, sniffing around the apartment until he found a plastic bag under the heater. Inside were bloody gauze pads. The woman had an opioid addiction. The gauze must have been hers, used to cover the places where she shot up. After that, I stopped trying to ignore it. I didn't talk about it, but I didn't deny it either, because it wasn't going away. I can't see her, not directly, but I know she's there. I know exactly what she looks like, even though I've never seen a picture of her. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in any of this, but I can feel her watching me, and it's growing stronger. I don't know what this is. I don't know why I have it, why my grandmother had it. I don't know why it always seems to be tied to places soaked in suffering. Is consciousness a frequency, something that lingers like radio waves long after the source is gone? Are we just antennas, picking up what's left behind? Or is it something worse? Something deeper, something I don't have the words to explain? All I know is this. I spent my whole life running from the feeling, and now I can't run anymore, because it has found me again. I had always known my father to be a man of reason. He was the type who didn't entertain nonsense, didn't believe in superstition, and certainly had no patience for ghost stories. He grew up in the countryside of Cuba, working the land like his father before him. Life was hard but simple. Days were spent in the fields, nights in the quiet warmth of their farmhouse. Nothing about his upbringing left room for fantasy or fear of the unknown. He wasn't scared of the dark, the woods, or the strange noises of the night. He knew what was out there: wild dogs, wandering cattle, the occasional snake. That's why, when he told me this story, I knew he wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't looking for attention or trying to scare anyone. He was just telling the truth, and that was what made it so much worse. It was late afternoon when it started. He had spent the day out in the fields, tending to the crops and checking on the livestock. It was the kind of work he had done all his life, and though the sun was relentless, he was used to it. As the hours passed, the sky darkened, and he knew it was time to head home. The walk wasn't long, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but by the time he made his way back through the trees, the last of the daylight was gone. The moon was out, though, and that was enough. He knew the land like the back of his hand. Every tree, every rock, every uneven patch of dirt. He didn't need a lantern or a flashlight. But then he smelled it. A thick, overpowering stench filled the air. It was the unmistakable scent of rotting meat, wet, putrid, and sickly sweet. He slowed his pace, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't uncommon for an animal to die out in the fields. A cow, a pig, even a dog could wander off and meet its end, and after a few days in the heat, the smell would be unbearable. But this was different. It wasn't just strong, it was fresh, like whatever was decaying had only just started to rot. He stepped forward cautiously, scanning the darkness ahead. The trees thinned out just before the farmhouse, giving way to an open clearing. That's when he saw it. Standing there in the moonlight was a horse. At least, that's what it looked like at first. It had the body of a horse, strong, muscular, covered in short, dark fur. But something was wrong. It had no head, no stump, no open wound, no sign that it had ever had one to begin with. It was smooth, like the head had simply never existed. He stopped cold. His heart hammered in his chest as he stared at it, waiting for his eyes to adjust, for his mind to make sense of what he was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe a branch was blocking part of the animal, or his own fear was making him see things that weren't there. But no matter how he moved, no matter what angle he looked from, the image remained the same. A headless horse, standing still in the clearing. It wasn't moving. It wasn't breathing. A deep, suffocating dread filled him, something he had never felt before. He had been around animals his entire life, had seen them sick, injured, even dead. But this was different. It was wrong in a way he couldn't explain. He took a step back, then another. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't listen. He had never believed in spirits or curses or anything like that, but at that moment, he didn't care what it was. All he knew was that he had to get away. Then, without warning, the smell grew stronger. It was suffocating now, thick and heavy in his lungs, like the very air had turned rotten. His stomach twisted, while rising in his throat. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the smell vanished. The clearing was empty. The horse was gone. He hadn't looked away. He hadn't blinked. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. There was no sound, no movement, nothing to indicate that it had ever been there at all. That was when he ran. He sprinted the rest of the way to the house, his legs burning, his chest tight with fear. He didn't stop until he was inside, The door slammed shut behind him. He stood there for a long time, gasping for breath, trying to convince himself that it hadn't happened, that his mind had played a trick on him, that exhaustion and darkness had made him see things that weren't real. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling. The weight of that moment, the unnatural stillness of the creature, the way his body had instinctively recoiled in fear, it wasn't something he could explain away. The next day, he went back to the clearing. The smell was gone. There were no tracks, no sign that anything had been there the night before. He never told anyone about it. Not at first. He didn't want to be laughed at, didn't want people thinking he was losing his mind. But over the years, he heard whispers from others, family members, neighbors, who had seen things out there, things they couldn't explain. Some spoke of strange figures in the woods, watching from a distance. Others mentioned animals acting strangely, cattle refusing to go near certain parts of the land, dogs barking at nothing. One old man swore that years ago, he had seen a headless cow standing at the edge of the trees, just staring. But no one ever talked about it for long. My father never forgot what he saw that night. He never tried to make sense of it, never tried to explain it away. He didn't believe in ghosts or demons, and he didn't care for stories about the supernatural. But he knew what he saw, and he never walked that way home after dark again. I used to think I was paranoid. I used to think I was the kind of person who saw problems where there were none, someone who jumped to conclusions too quickly. But now I know that paranoia is just another word for seeing things clearly before anyone else does. It started back in 2010, though I didn't know that at the time. Back then, we were just kids, fresh out of high school, moving through the world like nothing could touch us. My best friend Anna got her first iPhone that year, an old model now, but back then, it was new, exciting. We all had our phones, but hers was different. She was the first one in our group to really embrace social media, to post pictures of her life in that casual, carefree way that only teenagers do. She used it like we all did, texting, Facebook, taking pictures. But one day, something strange happened. Her phone would act weird sometimes. The screen would flicker, or apps would open by themselves. She figured it was just a glitch, nothing serious. There were times when she thought she heard a faint clicking noise on calls, like someone else was there. But she brushed it off. There was no reason to think otherwise. She only realized how wrong she was 6 years later. In 2016, Anna was in college, working on a creative writing degree. She was proud of it, of the little poems and short stories she managed to get published in small magazines. It was just a hobby, but she liked seeing her name in print. She was messing around online one night, looking up old articles she had written. Just curiosity. That was when she found them. The first thing that popped up was a random forum post with her name in it. She clicked, thinking maybe someone had referenced her work. What she found was worse than she could have ever imagined. It was a thread about her. Her picture, the one from the literary magazine, was plastered across the screen. Dozens of comments, crude, disgusting. Men asking for more, searching for nudes, photoshopping her face onto naked bodies. It wasn't just one thread. It was everywhere. She felt sick, scrolling through post after post, realizing that this wasn't just some random act of internet cruelty. This was targeted. Someone had been collecting pictures of her, tracking her, spreading them. And whoever it was, they had been doing it for years. For 3 years, she tried to find out who was behind it. She filed reports, searched through forums, contacted websites to take down the images. Some did. Most didn't. The internet doesn't forget. Every time she thought she had erased one piece of it, 10 more would pop up. She was helpless, stuck in an endless cycle of trying to reclaim something that was already gone. Then, in 2019, everything changed. She got a call from her younger sister, Brooke. A frantic, broken voice on the other end of the line. Brooke had found something. It was her husband's laptop. She hadn't been looking for anything, just cleaning up, moving files around. But then she saw a folder, one she didn't recognize. She clicked, and suddenly, she was looking at pictures of Anna. Not just the ones from the internet. These were different, more personal, pictures that no one else should have. Videos. Brooke opened one, and her stomach dropped. It was Anna, stepping in and out of the shower during a family vacation. The camera had been hidden somewhere in the bathroom. There were others. A sickening collection of voyeuristic images, stolen moments that should never have been captured. And worse, There were photos of her personal things. Her underwear. Some of them had been defiled, used in ways that made her want to throw up. There were more. Pictures of other women. Up skirts, in strip clubs, on beaches. Dozens, maybe hundreds. It wasn't just Anna. It was everyone. And then the truth came out. Her sister's husband, the man she had trusted, the man she had married, admitted it. He had been stalking Anna for over 10 years. 10 years. Before he had even met Brooke. He had been watching, waiting, inserting himself into their lives. He had hacked her phone back in 2010. He had been the one collecting her photos, spreading them online, searching for more. He had watched her, followed her, turned her life into his personal obsession. Anna took everything she had, the screenshots, the videos, the evidence she had collected over the years, and went to the police. But Brooke went back to him. She had been with him since she was 19. He had shaped her, controlled her, twisted her into someone who couldn't see what he really was. She defended him. She stayed. And the rest of the family turned against Anna. She was making things up. She was ruining a marriage. She was obsessed, vindictive. The police said they were looking into it. They didn't arrest him. They didn't charge him. And now, in 2025, he's still free. He's a doctor, a respected man, married, a baby on the way. And Anna? Anna lives with the knowledge that the man who violated her, who stalked her for over a decade, is out there, living his life, untouched, unpunished. That her own family turned their backs on her. That the internet still holds pieces of her that she will never get back. That no one came to help. That no one ever will. New Year's Day started like any other hungover morning. I woke up with my mouth dry, my head pounding, and the taste of cheap beer lingering on my tongue. The night before had been a blur of flashing lights, loud music, and too many drinks. I didn't even remember how I got home. I was still lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when my phone buzzed. It was my buddy, Chris. I didn't even have the energy to groan before answering. "Bro," he said the second I picked up. His voice had that excitement that didn't belong in the aftermath of a night like New Year's Eve. I met the love of my life last night. I barely listened as he kept talking, going on and on about some girl he met at the party. I rolled onto my side, rubbing my eyes. I wasn't in the mood for whatever romantic bullshit he was on about, but he wasn't letting it go. Said she was sleeping at his house right now, passed out cold. I was about to hang up when he mentioned something weird. "Dude, we drew all over her after she passed out. Look at this picture." A second later, my phone pinged with an incoming image. I swiped to open it, expecting some dumb prank, sharp dicks on her forehead or something. Instead, my stomach twisted. She wasn't just asleep. Her face was slack, her lips slightly parted. Her jaw hung at an unnatural angle, almost like it was dislocated. Her eyes, God, her eyes, were barely open, but they weren't looking at anything. Just slightly sunken, dull. Her skin looked wrong, too. Too pale, like she had no blood in her at all. I sat up fast, feeling like I was still drunk. I had never seen a dead person before, but something about that picture. "Chris," I said, my voice sharper than it should have been. "You need to check on her. She looks sick, man. Like really sick." He just laughed it off. Said she was just sleeping. He sounded so casual about it. I told him to check anyway. A couple of hours later, he called me back. "She's fine," he said, like I was crazy for worrying. "Dude, she's just sleeping." I wanted to believe him. Maybe it was just a bad angle, bad lighting. Maybe I was still out of it from last night. I went about my day, but something in my stomach wouldn't settle. Then my phone rang again. Another friend. "Hey man, you heard about that girl Chris was with?" Something about his voice made my skin crawl. I already knew what he was going to say. "She's dead." I don't even remember the drive to Chris's house. One second I was in my apartment. The next I was pounding on his door. It took him a while to answer. When he finally did, he looked off. His face was pale, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. I pushed past him. The house stank, booze, sweat, stale air. The kind of smell that lingers after a party that went too hard. I walked down the hallway toward his bedroom, my heart hammering. I knew what I was about to see. She was still in his bed, lying on her back, arms limp at her sides, legs tangled in the sheets. She looked worse than in the picture. Her skin had taken on a grayish tint. Her lips were bluish now. Her body looked stiff, almost unnaturally still. I took a step closer, my breath coming in short gasps. The sharp marks were still on her skin. Stupid little doodles, random words. As if she had just been some drunk girl to mess with. My stomach twisted, while rising in my throat. "Chris," I said, my voice shaking. "When did she stop breathing?" He didn't answer. I turned to him. He was standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. He swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the floor. "I thought she was just passed out," he mumbled. "She was breathing this morning. I swear, man." I looked back at her. She had been here the whole time. Like this. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched her wrist. Ice cold. She had been dead for hours. Chris was still standing there, silent. "You need to call someone," I said. "Now." He still didn't move. I had never felt this kind of fear before. This wasn't some horror movie, some ghost story. This was real. The worst part, she had died here, in his bed, while he slept, while he thought she was just passed out, and no one had noticed. I was young when I first heard about it, too young to understand what it really meant. The professor was a well-known figure in the world of epidemiology, an expert in flu strains, pandemics, and disease control. His lectures were always packed, but this particular one felt different. It wasn't about common flu outbreaks or public health initiatives. He was telling a story, and though most of the students seemed to brush it off as an interesting anecdote, something about it stuck with me. In the early 90s, he was giving a routine lecture when two men in dark suits walked in. They didn't wait for him to finish. They walked straight up to him and told him he had to leave immediately. No explanation, no hesitation. They had government credentials, and that was enough. He was put on a plane within hours. It was a private flight, nothing commercial. Just him and a few others, men who didn't say much, who only asked him questions. He was one of the world's leading experts on infectious diseases, and their questions were not idle curiosity. They wanted to know everything he knew about smallpox. Not just the usual things, but the worst-case scenarios, how to contain an outbreak, how long the virus could survive in different conditions, how feasible it would be to produce a weaponized strain. By the time they landed, he knew something was wrong. The plane touched down in Sweden, and he was taken to a secure location. No hotel, no briefing room at a university. Just a closed-off space where he was kept waiting until another group arrived. This time, there were no government agents. It was a single man, older, well-dressed, clearly important. The Shah of Jordan. He grilled the professor for hours. The questions came fast, sharp, focused. They weren't hypothetical. This wasn't academic curiosity. The Shah wanted specifics. How to neutralize smallpox if it was released in a city. What could be done to protect people? How difficult it would be to manufacture. What delivery methods could be used. How long the virus would remain viable. The professor answered every question as best he could, but there was one thing he couldn't ignore. This wasn't a discussion about the past. This was about something happening now. The flight back was silent, tense. The men who had brought him there debriefed him, running through every detail of the conversation. They weren't just listening, they were trying to put together a puzzle. By the time they landed, they had a conclusion. Jordan knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to suggest that someone somewhere had obtained weaponized smallpox. The numbers were impossible to comprehend. When the Soviet Union collapsed, thousands of weapons, research projects, and stockpiles went unaccounted for. It was chaos, a perfect storm for dangerous materials to go missing. The professor knew that smallpox had been eradicated in the wild, that only a few sanctioned labs were supposed to have it. But that wasn't reality. Reality was that 2,000 metric tons of weaponized smallpox had disappeared when the USSR fell apart. The implications were horrifying. Smallpox was one of the deadliest viruses in history, with a fatality rate of up to 30%. The weaponized strain developed by the Soviets was worse, engineered for increased lethality, more efficient spread. If even a fraction of that missing stockpile had fallen into the wrong hands, the consequences would be unimaginable. The professor never got answers. He never found out why Jordan was asking those questions, or if the threat was ever neutralized. But he knew one thing: governments don't ask those kinds of questions unless they have a reason, and the world never heard about any of it. I sat there in that lecture hall, staring at the professor as he moved on to his next topic, as if he hadn't just dropped the most horrifying fact I had ever heard. 2,000 metric tons of weaponized smallpox. Missing, and no one talks about it. No one knows where it went. Maybe it was destroyed, lost to time. Maybe it's sitting in a forgotten storage facility, waiting to be discovered by someone who doesn't understand what they've found. Or maybe, just maybe, someone still has it. Waiting. The world is fragile. We walk around every day thinking we're safe, thinking our biggest problems are things we see on the news. But the real dangers, the ones we never hear about, they don't go away. They just stay hidden, buried under layers of silence, until one day they aren't. And by then, it's already too late. My freshman year of college, I had a roommate named Mark. He was a quiet guy, kept to himself mostly, and had this odd habit of carrying around a fishing rod. At first, I thought it was just a quirky hobby. Maybe he was into fishing and liked to keep his rod close, but as time went on, I realized something was off. There weren't any fishing spots nearby, at least not within 30 miles. Yet every couple of days, he'd announce that he was going fishing, grab his rod, and disappear for about half an hour. When he came back, his eyes were bloodshot, his pupils blown wide, and he smelled faintly of something chemical. I knew what was going on, but he never did anything in front of me. He was careful like that. And since it didn't really affect me directly, I never had the nerve to say anything about it. Maybe it was cowardice, or maybe I just didn't want to deal with the fallout of confronting someone about their drug use. Either way, I let it slide. One day, he told me he was going fishing with a few friends. Same routine. He grabbed his rod and walked out, shutting the door behind him. I didn't think much of it. I had my own stuff to focus on, homework, studying, the usual. But about 20 minutes later, there was a loud, urgent pounding on the dorm room door. Not a normal knock. This was hard, frantic. I opened the door to see two guys I didn't know standing there, struggling to hold Mark up between them. He was unconscious, his arms limp, his head rolling forward. They barely acknowledged me before pushing past and dropping him right on the floor of our dorm. His body hit the carpet with a dull thud. One of them muttered something about him falling asleep and that they had to carry him back. Then they told me not to call the RA because he was already on probation. I barely had time to process what they were saying before they turned and left, shutting the door behind them like it was just another normal night. I stood there, staring at Mark's motionless body on the floor. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale. I bent down and shook him, calling his name. No response. I grabbed a bottle of water from my desk and poured some on his face. Nothing. My pulse started to pick up. This wasn't just some regular high. Something was wrong. I tried everything I could think of, shaking him, slapping his face lightly, even yelling. Nothing worked. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called campus police. Then I ran down the hall to get the RA. The next few minutes felt like a blur. The cops arrived quickly, followed by paramedics. Suddenly, our tiny dorm room was packed with people. 8, maybe 9 of them, all trying to get him to wake up. I backed up against the wall, watching as they worked. One of the officers checked his pulse and immediately called out that they didn't have one. Time slowed. I watched as they started CPR, pushing on his chest with a force that seemed too violent, too rough, like they were breaking him instead of saving him. Someone else pulled out a defibrillator, shouting clear before shocking him. The sound of it filled the room, a sharp electronic whine followed by a jolt. Nothing. Another shock. Then suddenly a breath. His chest rose, his body jerking. He was back. But it wasn't relief that filled the room next. It was chaos. As soon as he came to, he lashed out. He started swinging, punching at the people who had just brought him back to life. His face was twisted, red, eyes wild and unfocused. He was swearing, shouting, looking around like he didn't recognize anyone. Then his eyes landed on me. For a second, everything went quiet in my head. The only thing I could focus on was the way he was looking at me. Like he knew. Like he blamed me. His fists clenched and unclenched, his whole body trembling. The paramedics restrained him, trying to calm him down, but he was fighting them, thrashing against their grip. One of the cops turned to me and said, "If you hadn't called when you did, he'd be dead." It didn't feel like I'd done anything heroic. It just felt like I was watching something spiral completely out of control. They took him away that night. He was expelled from school, kicked out for good. I never saw him again. 5 months later, I got a text. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew immediately who it was from. The message was short. "You ruined my life. You're going to pay for this." I sat there staring at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. For weeks after that, I jumped at every sound, looked over my shoulder everywhere I went. Every time I walked into my dorm, I half expected to find him standing there waiting. But nothing ever happened. 6 years have passed, and I've never heard from him again. I think I'm in the clear. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I still see his face. The way he looked at me when he realized what had happened. The pure hatred in his eyes. And I wonder if somewhere out there, he's still thinking about me, still waiting, still angry. And I wonder if I really am in the clear at all. I was 19 when it happened, still living with my grandmother in a small, aging house a few blocks away from one of the biggest malls in the city. The area around it was strange. Half of it was a commercial hub with expensive shops and chain restaurants. The other half a slowly decaying sprawl of rundown apartments and forgotten streets. It wasn't dangerous, not exactly. People got mugged sometimes, and every so often, someone would get followed home by a stranger with bad intentions. But it wasn't the kind of place where people got killed in the street. I had moved in with my grandmother because it made more sense than trying to afford a place on my own. Rent was a joke, even 5 years ago, and insuring a car on top of that would have been impossible. My parents still lived 45 minutes outside the city, and I wasn't about to spend half my paycheck just getting to work. So I stayed with her, helping out when I could, trying not to make her feel like she was being babysat. My grandmother had dementia, though. Not the obvious kind, not the kind that made it impossible for her to live alone yet, but it was there, hidden beneath her intelligence and sharp wit. Most days, she was fine, sharp as ever, cooking dinner, complaining about politics, asking me about my day. But sometimes she would slip. Sometimes she would do something strange. She was paranoid, more than anything. I would find furniture shoved in front of doors, knickknacks carefully stacked on top of each other in odd places, as if she was setting up a trap to see if someone had entered the house while she slept. She locked cabinets that didn't need to be locked, double-checked doors that had already been bolted shut. She wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't admit that she was afraid, but I knew. That night, I was just about to go to bed when I heard the knock at the door. It wasn't a normal knock. It wasn't the quick, polite rap of a delivery driver or the heavy pound of someone in a hurry. It was slow, deliberate. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. My grandmother tensed immediately. She had been in the hallway, on her way to her bedroom, but at the sound she froze. Her head tilted slightly, her body going rigid. I sighed, already knowing how this was going to go. If I ignored it, she would get anxious. If I tried to check the peephole, she would make a fuss about the barricade she had set up behind the door, a bizarre arrangement of heavy objects stacked in a way that made it a pain to move. So I went to the window instead. Our house was old. The windows were the crank-out kind, the ones that opened outward from the bottom in a slow, groaning movement. The one nearest the door was low to the ground, just a few feet off the porch. I approached carefully, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. And there she was, a woman crouched in front of our door. She was positioned low, near the bottom of the doorframe, as if she had been trying to stay out of sight. Her hands were braced against her knees, her face partially hidden in the shadows. She wasn't wearing a jacket, just a thin hoodie, even though it was the middle of winter. And she was holding something. A long, blunt object rested against her shoulder. It wasn't a baseball bat, not exactly, but something like it. A pipe, maybe. A wooden club. I couldn't tell in the dim light. For a moment, I thought she was looking right at me. My breath caught in my throat, my body going rigid. But her eyes weren't on me. They were locked on the door, her head tilted slightly, lips moving as if she were whispering something to herself. My stomach clenched. I took a slow step back, trying to stay out of sight. I turned to my grandmother, who was still frozen in the hallway, staring toward the door. Her face was unreadable, but I could see the way her fingers twitched at her sides. I knew what was going to happen before it did. Before I could stop her, she took a step forward. "Wait," I whispered, but it was too late. She moved quickly for someone her age, slipping past me toward the door. Her hand reached for the locks. I grabbed her wrist before she could touch them. She looked at me confused, as if she had already forgotten why she was moving. But then the confusion faded, replaced by something else. Annoyance. "She's cold," my grandmother murmured, as if it were obvious. I tightened my grip on her wrist. "No." She frowned, eyes flicking toward the door again. I glanced back at the window. The woman hadn't moved. I forced my grandmother to step back, guiding her away from the entrance. She resisted at first, her body tense, but eventually she relented. I led her to her bedroom, ushering her inside. "Lock the door," I told her. She hesitated, but something in my tone must have convinced her, because she did. Then I called the police. I kept my voice low, whispering into the phone as I pressed myself against the wall beside the window. The dispatcher sounded bored, like this was just another late-night call from someone too paranoid to sleep. I described the woman, told them she had a weapon, that she was trying to break in. Then I waited, and waited. The woman didn't leave. She didn't pound on the door, didn't shout or demand to be let in. Instead, she pressed her hand against the window, fingers splayed wide. Her breath fogged the glass as she whispered something I couldn't hear. Then she tried to push the window open. The crank held, keeping it from budging more than an inch. But that inch was enough to make my skin crawl. I clenched my fists. I didn't have a weapon. There was a kitchen knife in the next room, but I didn't want to leave my spot, didn't want to give her the chance to slip inside. So I did the only thing I could think of. I stepped forward, right up to the glass, and hissed through my teeth, "If you don't leave, I'll cut your fucking hand off." The woman froze. For the first time, she seemed to really see me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a long, terrible second, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hand. She stepped back, and then she sulked away. She didn't run, didn't panic, just wandered off, as if she were disappointed, as if I had hurt her feelings. But she didn't leave entirely. For the next hour, I heard her circling the house, testing windows, rattling the back door. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, phone clenched in my hand, waiting. The police never came. Eventually, the noises stopped. Eventually, I fell asleep, still holding the phone. By morning, she was gone. But the feeling wasn't. That sense of something wrong, something watching, something waiting just beyond the edges of the light. And even now, 5 years later, I still check my locks twice before bed. The drive to the cabins was long. For hours of winding roads, fading cell service, and the kind of deepening silence that only comes when you leave civilization behind. The further we went, the darker it got, the roads narrowing into twisting passes through thick forests. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time we arrived, leaving only the pale glow of the moon and the distant pinpricks of stars above. I had been feeling off since we left, just a dull ache in my stomach that I had brushed off as nothing serious. Probably just something I ate earlier, I told myself. But by the time we pulled up to the cabins, the discomfort had settled into a steady, persistent pain. Not sharp, not unbearable, just enough to make everything feel slightly off. The cabins were simple. A single-story structure with a pitched roof, weathered wooden walls, and a front porch that creaked underfoot. Inside, it was cozy, warm from the fire we quickly built in the stone fireplace. There were a couple of bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living area with an old couch and some worn-out chairs. It smelled like pine and old wood, the air heavy with the scent of burning logs. We unpacked, set up our sleeping spots, and made a quick dinner. I barely touched mine. My stomach wasn't letting up, and eating made it worse. I tried to act normal, but I could feel myself slowing down, my movements heavier, my body sluggish. The others eventually called it a night, retreating to their rooms while I stayed in the living room, staring into the embers of the fire. The pain was worse when I lay down, so I kept sitting up, trying to find some position that didn't make my stomach feel like it was twisting in on itself. The fireplace had a glass door. We had closed it, but we hadn't latched it because the fire was nearly out, just a couple of logs still glowing faintly in the ash. I kept watching them as I debated whether I should try to sleep or just ride it out. Eventually, I decided to head to the bathroom, thinking maybe whatever was wrecking my insides just needed to work its way out. The bathroom was small, the kind where your knees nearly touch the wall when you sit on the toilet. The light flickered slightly when I turned it on, the old wiring struggling. That's when I heard the sound, a dull thump from the other room. I froze, listening. My mind immediately started working through the possibilities. Maybe one of the guys had gotten up for water, or maybe something outside had shifted in the wind. But no, it had sounded heavier than that, something solid hitting the floor. A couple of minutes passed. The pain in my stomach had sharpened, but my brain was focused on that noise. Then it clicked. The fire. I shoved myself off the toilet, barely managing to yank my pants up as I stumbled out of the bathroom. The second I entered the living room, I saw it. Smoke. It was already spreading, thickening in the air. One of the logs had rolled out of the fireplace, knocking the glass door open, and landed on the rug. It hadn't fully caught yet, but the heat had already darkened the fabric. A few more minutes, and it would have gone up in flames. My heart slammed into my ribs as I rushed forward, grabbing the log with the fireplace poker and shoving it back inside. Smoke billowed up, making my eyes water. I reached for the metal latch and slammed the door shut, coughing as the acrid air filled my lungs. I threw open a window, gasping in the cold night air. My hands were shaking, my pulse hammering in my ears. I could still see the dark spot on the rug where the log had landed, the singed fabric an ugly reminder of how close it had come to catching fire. I stood there for a long time, hands on my knees, trying to calm down. The smoke slowly started to clear, thinning as the cold air pushed it out. That's when I felt it. A deep, nauseating wave of pain in my gut, sharper than before. It wasn't just a stomachache. Something was wrong. I barely made it to the sink before I threw up. My whole body shuddered with the force of it, my stomach twisting violently. I clutched the edge of the counter, gasping, sweat dripping down my forehead. The pain wasn't just in my stomach anymore. It was radiating out, spreading like fire through my lower right side. I knew then that this wasn't something I could just sleep off. I stumbled to one of the bedrooms and shook my friend awake. It took a few tries before he groggily opened his eyes, blinking at me in confusion. "I need to go to a hospital." I managed to get out. That woke him up fast. The drive to the nearest town was a blur. The road twisted and turned, every bump sending fresh waves of agony through my body. I could barely keep my head up, my vision swimming. It felt like my insides were being squeezed, like something was about to burst. By the time we reached the hospital, I could barely walk. The nurse took one look at me and rushed me back. Tests, IVs, a blur of doctors and bright lights. Then the verdict, appendicitis. I was in surgery within hours. When I woke up, groggy and disoriented, the doctor told me my appendix had been on the verge of rupturing. If I had waited any longer, it could have been much worse. I lay there in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, my body aching but my mind racing. If my appendix hadn't decided to go nuclear that night, I wouldn't have been in the bathroom. I wouldn't have been awake to hear the log fall. And if I hadn't caught it in time, the image of that log sitting on the rug, smoldering, waiting to catch, wouldn't leave my head. It was weeks before I could shake the feeling. Even now, when I think about that night, I don't know what scares me more. The fact that my appendix nearly killed me, or the fact that, in a way, it saved my life. I work for a museum in a town that claims to be one of the most haunted places in America. That sort of reputation brings in tourists, and history sells better when you attach a good ghost story to it. A big part of my job is leading historical tours, and one of the main attractions is an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. It's a massive, crumbling structure, a place that hasn't been used as an actual asylum in decades. Now, the university owns it and uses parts of the building for storage and research, but most of it is off-limits to the public. Still, it has a presence in town lore. There are all kinds of stories about what went on in that place. Things that probably did happen, and things that definitely didn't. But one particular story has stuck with me more than the rest. It has nothing to do with ghosts or spirits, no flickering lights or eerie whispers. Just a stain on the floor of one of the rooms, a stain with a history that's disturbingly real. Before I started working for the museum, I thought the story was just an urban legend. The tale goes that in the early 1900s, a young woman who had been committed to the asylum disappeared in the middle of winter. She wasn't seen leaving, but she wasn't found inside either. With the temperatures well below freezing and heavy snow covering the landscape, the staff assumed she had tried to escape and gotten lost, or that she had frozen somewhere in the woods. Either way, they figured she would have to return eventually, if she was still alive. But she never came back. Months passed, and as winter gave way to early spring, a smell started to rise from a part of the asylum that had been closed off for construction. It was unmistakable. When the staff investigated, they found her body in one of the abandoned rooms. She had died there, alone, and her body had been left undisturbed for the entire winter. The extreme cold had preserved her for a time, but as the weather warmed, the natural process of decomposition had taken over. By the time she was found, her body had softened, breaking down into a horrific mess of tissue and fluids that had seeped into the concrete floor beneath her. They removed what was left of her, but the stain remained. It had soaked too deeply into the porous surface, leaving behind a permanent reminder of her death. I always assumed this was just another one of those macabre stories passed down by students and townies over the years, exaggerated into something larger than life. But after I started working at the museum, I learned otherwise. We have records of the woman's disappearance and death, newspaper clippings, old medical files, even grainy black and white photographs of her remains where she was found. There is no doubt that it happened. And the stain, it's real. As part of my job, I sometimes have to enter areas of the asylum that aren't accessible to the public. We store some museum materials there, tucked away in rooms that haven't been renovated or touched in decades. The first time I entered that particular room, I didn't think much of it. It was just another part of the old, decaying building, peeling paint, exposed beams, rusted pipes. Then I saw the floor. The stain is larger than I expected, spanning several feet across. At first, I thought it was just water damage or some old spill that had darkened over time. But standing there, looking at it, I felt an odd kind of dread settle in my stomach. It didn't look like water damage. The edges were too irregular, the center too dark. There was a heaviness to it, something that made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain. I told myself it was just a stain, just discoloration on an old floor. But the more I looked at it, the more I thought about how it had gotten there. About the months that woman had spent in that room, her body slowly breaking down, seeping into the very foundation of the building. And the smell. I've read enough about decomposition to know how powerful and invasive it can be. Once it sinks into something, it never really goes away. Every time I have to go back into that room, I feel that same unease. It doesn't matter how many times I remind myself that it's just a stain, just a patch of discolored concrete. The knowledge of what caused it lingers in my mind, refusing to let me treat it as just another mark on an old floor. I avoid stepping too close. It's irrational, but I can't help it. Over the years, I've noticed that people don't talk about the stain much. Even the staff who have been here for decades, the ones who are usually quick to share the asylum's more gruesome tales, tend to avoid the subject. Maybe it's because it isn't a ghost story. There's nothing supernatural about it, no mystery, no lingering spirit. Just the undeniable evidence of a real person's suffering, forever imprinted on the ground. And that, to me, is more unsettling than any ghost story could ever be. I don't believe in the supernatural, but I do believe in history. And history isn't always clean. It doesn't always fade. Sometimes, it leaves stains that never go away. The first thing I remember is the sound. A deep, crushing boom that tore through the walls and sent a shockwave through the air. I wasn't awake when it happened, not fully. My body was already shifting out of sleep when the blast hit, like the sound itself had reached into my dreams and yanked me into waking. 1 second, I was warm under my blanket, half conscious, and the next, I was weightless. The explosion picked me up and threw me. I didn't know it at the time, but it had come from outside, somewhere near the front of the house. The force of it sent me off my bed, and I hit the ground hard. My head bounced off the floor, my body rattled from the impact, and then came the pain, a sharp, burning sensation in my foot. For a few seconds, I didn't understand what had happened. My heart pounded, my ears rang with a high-pitched whine, and my brain was struggling to catch up. The darkness of my room was cut by flickering light, a glow that didn't belong. It wasn't the soft yellow of a lamp or the cold blue of the moon. It was orange. It danced on the walls in strange, shifting shapes. Then I smelled it. Smoke. I tried to stand, but the moment I put weight on my right foot, something hot and sharp dug into my skin. I dropped back to the floor, gasping, my hands gripping my ankle. The pain made my head spin. I reached down and felt something wet. When I lifted my fingers, they were sticky and dark. Blood. Glass. That's what had cut me. The window above my bed was gone, replaced by a jagged frame of broken shards. The explosion had shattered it, and when I'd hit the ground, I must have landed on a piece of it. A new sound broke through the ringing in my ears, my dad's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the panic in them. He was yelling, his voice raw, carried by the chaos. I needed to get to him. I tried to stand again, but my foot refused to hold me. The pain was like fire, spreading through my ankle and up my leg. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to move. If I couldn't walk, I'd crawl. The house was different now. Everything that had been familiar was suddenly wrong. The walls had cracks running through them like veins, and pieces of the ceiling had fallen onto the floor. Smoke was pouring in from somewhere, thick and heavy, making it hard to see. The air tasted bitter, like something was burning. I slid across the floor, dragging myself toward the doorway. Each movement sent another shock of pain through my foot, but I bit down and kept going. I had to find my dad. By the time I reached the hallway, I could hear more than just my father's voice. There were other sounds, screaming, crying, the deep groan of the house settling under the damage. The walls trembled with every new explosion outside. The city was shaking. I turned toward the stairs. My dad had been yelling from downstairs, near the front of the house. The banister was cracked, some of the spindles missing entirely. The steps were covered in dust and broken pieces of plaster. I knew I couldn't walk down. My foot wouldn't hold me, and I was too afraid to stand. So I scooted forward, sliding onto the first step. I sat down and pushed myself down the stairs, one at a time, feeling each impact rattle through my spine. Halfway down, I heard something else, something worse. A deep, cracking sound, like wood splitting under pressure. Then the house groaned. The walls were moving. For a second, I thought the whole place was about to come down. A huge section of the second floor, somewhere behind me, collapsed, sending debris and dust pouring down the stairwell. I curled into myself, covering my head as the world rumbled around me. When the dust settled, I opened my eyes. The stairs were still there, but the top of the house wasn't. I could see the night sky through a jagged hole in the ceiling, and through it, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Fire. Somewhere outside, beyond the destruction, a building was burning. Flames stretched toward the sky, their light reflecting off the smoke like a second sunrise. I forced myself to move again. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, my breath was coming in short gasps. The smoke was getting worse, filling my lungs with every inhale. My foot was still bleeding, leaving smudges of red on the floor behind me. I turned toward the living room, and then I saw her, our nanny. She was standing near the couch, her arms wrapped around something, her face pale. Her mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. She looked down, and I followed her gaze. Her arms were covered in blood. For a second, I thought it was hers. Then I saw what she was holding. My brother. His face was slack, his body limp in her arms. Blood stained his clothes, soaking through the fabric in dark patches. I didn't understand. I didn't know what had happened to him. My dad's voice rang through the chaos again. He was near the front of the house, shouting out the broken window. I turned toward the sound, my body moving on instinct. The front door was gone. Not open, gone. The explosion had torn it off its hinges, leaving a gaping hole in the wall. The street outside was a nightmare. Flashing lights, running figures, the distant pop-pop-pop of something sharp and mechanical. My dad was standing in the doorway, his face twisted with something I couldn't name. He was looking at something outside, his fists clenched at his sides. And then, everything blurred. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes. The heat of the night air as I was carried outside. The sharp wail of sirens echoing down the street. The pressure of hands on my foot, wrapping something tight around the wound. The inside of an ambulance, its lights casting everything in red and white. The feeling of exhaustion settling deep into my bones, heavier than anything I had ever felt before. Then nothing. I woke up in a hospital bed. The room was white, the air cold and sterile. My foot was wrapped in thick layers of bandages, propped up on a pillow. The pain was dull now, hidden under something else, something deeper. I didn't cry. I don't know why. Maybe I was too tired, or maybe I just didn't understand enough to be afraid. My dad was there. He looked different, older somehow. He had a cut above his eyebrow, a line of dried blood running down his temple. There was no relief in his face when he saw me awake. Just something quiet, something heavy. I didn't ask where my brother was. I think I already knew. They made a movie about it. Years later, when I was older, I found out. The Kingdom, it wasn't anything special. Just a movie, just a story. But for me, it wasn't a story. It was the first thing I ever remembered. And I still have the scars to prove it. I met him when I was 18. He was 31, an ex-military man with 2 tours overseas. working for a well-known local farmer and the son of a Methodist preacher. On paper, he seemed like a dream, a steady, responsible, mature man who had seen the world and settled into a good life. Looking back, I don't know if I was blinded by my own loneliness or if I just wanted so badly to believe in the fantasy of him. But either way, I walked straight into something far worse than I ever could have imagined. We met on Facebook, and within a couple of weeks of talking, he made the drive out to see me. He brought beers, and after a few, I ended up in the back of his truck. He had the whole setup, sleeping bag, blankets, the works. It wasn't the first time he'd done that, and I asked if I was the youngest girl he had brought there. He told me no. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now, I realize how casual he was about it, how little hesitation he had in admitting that there had been others. Younger ones. I should have run then, but I didn't. After that night, he started coming around more. He met my mom, hung out for a few hours, played the part of a charming, respectful boyfriend. He had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world when he was with you. And when he wasn't, you'd spend every second waiting for him to come back, feeling like you needed him. That should have been my first real warning. Real love doesn't make you feel desperate. A few months in, I introduced him to my best friend. She was younger than me, still a minor, and I watched as he charmed her, the same way he had done to me. Before I even knew what was happening, they were sleeping together. I was devastated, but instead of leaving, I convinced myself that if he wanted her, and she wanted me, then we could make it work. One big, happy relationship. It felt like a solution at the time, but all it did was give him control over both of us. He stopped coming around as much. When I saw him, it was always brief, rushed, like he had somewhere more important to be. I started to feel like an afterthought. I told myself it was just jealousy, but something was off. She wasn't the same anymore. She was distant, quieter. And then he disappeared. I assumed he had chosen her over me, so I cut ties with her completely. I was heartbroken, humiliated, and angry, but I never imagined how much worse things really were. I sent him a text after 9 days of silence, telling him it was over. He barely reacted. Just one word. Oh, like he hadn't even noticed. I thought that was the end of it. A month later, he was arrested. At first, it was just a drug charge, but then the truth started coming out. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation had been watching him for months. That black car I kept seeing everywhere, that was them. I had been under surveillance, not because I was a suspect, but because I was a potential victim. The best man from my mom and stepdad's wedding was one of the officers working the case. He knew what I had been involved in, what I had been dangerously close to. He took a plea deal. They put him away for production and distribution of child pornography. But that was only part of it. The real horror was the barn. 5 girls, all my age or younger, locked in an abandoned barn in the dead of winter. He had been keeping them there, using them, selling them. My best friend had been one of them. He had been injecting her with drugs, getting her hooked, and sneaking men into her room while she was out of her mind. She never told me. She knew I loved him. She didn't want to hurt me. I can't describe the sickness I felt when I found out. The way my skin crawled knowing I had let this man touch me, love me, control me. The way I had let him near my best friend. The way I had ignored my instincts, the red flags that had been there from the start. I could have ended up in that barn. I could have been one of them. I was lucky. She wasn't. She got out. She went to a home for trafficking victims, where she stayed until she turned 18. She survived, but the scars will never leave her. And I know now that what happened to her could have just as easily happened to me. I spent years trying to make sense of it. The shame, the guilt, the rage. How did I not see it? How did I let him do this? How did I not stop him? But the truth is, people like him don't operate in the open. They hide behind their charm, their status, their reputations. They make you trust them, make you love them, make you blind. And by the time you see the truth, it's too late. He's in prison now, but it's not enough. Nothing will ever be enough. He destroyed lives. He stole innocence. He left behind wounds that will never fully heal. If I ever see him again, I don't know what I'll do. I don't know if I'd be able to hold myself back. But I do know this. I won't be silent. I won't let my shame keep me from warning others. If you're reading this, if you've ever ignored your gut because someone seemed too good to be true, if you've ever made excuses for someone who made you uncomfortable, listen to me. Trust yourself. The world is full of people like him. They look normal, they seem safe, but they are monsters, and they are waiting for someone like you to let them in. Be careful who you trust. Be careful who you love. Be careful who you let into your life. I wasn't, and I will never stop paying for it. I never really asked her about work. She'd come home exhausted most nights, just collapsing onto the couch with this empty look in her eyes. Some nights, she'd stare at the wall for a long time before saying anything. Working at a youth mental hospital does that to a person, I guess. You hear things, see things that stick with you. Things that don't fade, no matter how much you try to bury them. One night, she told me about a patient. It was late, past midnight, and we were lying in bed. She was on her side, staring at the wall. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "There was this girl." Her voice was quiet, distant. I didn't say anything. I just waited. "She came in after a suicide pact," she continued. 3 girls. They were supposed to jump in front of an Amtrak train together. She was the only one who didn't. The way she said it sent a shiver through me. I could see it in my head too clearly. 3 figures standing near the tracks, the deep rumble of an approaching train, the roar of metal and wind. 2 bodies gone. 1 left standing, frozen in place, watching the aftermath. They found her near the tracks, she said. Catatonic. She hadn't moved for hours. The girl was admitted on suicide watch. She barely spoke. They had to monitor her every second because she wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. Some nights, the staff found her curled in a ball, whispering to herself. Other nights, she just stared at the wall, completely still, as if she were waiting for something. It took weeks before she even reacted to anyone. It took longer before she said her first words. She kept saying it should have been all 3 of them, she told me. She was convinced she'd ruined it, that she was a coward. Every day was a slow battle. The nurses kept her alive, kept her body moving, forced her to eat, to talk, to acknowledge the world around her. The therapists worked on the guilt, the endless loop of what-ifs. What if she had jumped? What if she had stopped them? What if? She wrestled with it every day, every hour, unable to find a way out. Eventually, she started responding to therapy. She was still quiet, still hollow, but she was talking, participating, nodding when spoken to. It was progress, even if it was small. After a couple of months, she was cleared to go home. She wasn't cured, nobody expected her to be, but she was stable enough to be discharged. Her mom picked her up that morning. It was supposed to be a fresh start, the first real step toward a normal life again. She was home for 15 minutes, my girlfriend whispered. The words hung in the dark like a weight pressing down on my chest. Her mom went upstairs to check on her. She'd gone straight to her room, said she just wanted to be alone for a little while. 15 minutes. That's all it took. When her mom opened the door, she found her hanging from the closet rod. The bed was still made, the suitcase still packed, as if she'd never truly believed she'd be there long enough to unpack. They think she had planned it for weeks, she said. That she had convinced herself she had to do it at home. That if she had died in the clinic, it would have been too much for the other patients. The thought made me sick. She had walked out of that hospital with everyone believing she was getting better. She had smiled at the nurses, hugged her doctor, waved as she left. She had fooled them all, maybe even herself. Maybe she thought she could do it, maybe she thought she could live, but the moment she was alone, it was too much. The silence, the emptiness of her room, the knowledge that no one was watching her anymore. She must have planned it down to the minute. She knew exactly how long it would take for her mom to come upstairs. She knew she wouldn't have time to second-guess herself. She made sure of it. My girlfriend didn't say anything after that. She just lay there, staring at the wall, her breath slow and steady. But I knew she wasn't asleep. I didn't sleep either. I knew something was wrong the moment I felt the pressure. Not an impact, not a slam, just pressure, sudden and overwhelming, like the weight of the world had settled on me in an instant. I didn't hear a crunch or a snap, no dramatic sound effect, just my own heartbeat hammering in my ears and the air squeezing out of my lungs as I hit the pavement. For a second, I didn't even understand what had happened. One moment, I was stepping behind my car, reaching for the gate. The next, I was on the ground, my ribs pressed into the hard surface of the driveway, my legs twisted awkwardly beneath me, and something massive was pinning me down. It wasn't just weight, it was force, unyielding, unstoppable. I twisted my head, gasping, straining to look. My car. My own damn car. The driver's side door was still open, angled slightly. The shift knob. Had I left it in neutral? Had I forgotten the parking brake? The thought barely formed before it was crushed by pain. My lower body was pinned between the metal and the stone pillar of my gate. The pressure made it hard to think. It wasn't sharp, not yet. No tearing sensation, no searing agony, just an unbearable, suffocating crush that stole every other thought from my mind. I tried to push up with my arms. They slid uselessly against the pavement. No leverage. I tried to pull my legs free, but there was nothing to pull. No space to move. I was stuck. The realization didn't come in a single moment. It seeped in, slow and suffocating. At first I fought it, pushing, shifting, trying to press against the car, but it didn't budge. My arms started to shake. My breathing was ragged, too fast. The weight wasn't changing. My legs weren't responding. I wasn't getting out. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds. Time had lost its shape, melting into one endless stretch of pain and panic. My chest rose and fell too quickly, gulping at air that wasn't helping. The world was tilting around me, spinning in and out of focus, but I forced myself to breathe slower. Had to think. Had to move. I reached for my pocket for my phone. My fingers found the smooth, familiar shape, but my hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I forced my thumb over the screen, smearing sweat and dirt across the glass, trying to unlock it. The emergency call screen. My mind screamed at me to dial. But then, the coldest realization of all. No signal. Of course, the house was in a dead zone. A few feet inside, the Wi-Fi worked, but out here, at the edge of the driveway, there was nothing. Just a useless rectangle of glass and plastic in my trembling hands. A wave of nausea rolled through me. My stomach clenched, my ribs tightening against the pavement. No one was coming. I squeezed my eyes shut. My breathing hitched. No, I couldn't let this happen. I twisted my upper body, reaching toward the car. If I could just grab the steering wheel, pull something. But my fingers only brushed air. The angle was wrong. The space too tight. Nothing. I sucked in a shaking breath. My hands felt numb. My legs. I tried to move them again. Nothing. Not even a twitch. The pressure was still there, steady and crushing, but there was something else now, too. A deep, gnawing cold creeping up my body, spreading from the trapped limbs outward. I clenched my jaw. I didn't want to name it. Didn't want to admit what it meant. Time passed in fragments. The sun shifted above me. Shadows stretched across the pavement. The pain in my ribs faded, but not in the way I wanted. My arms were tingling now. My breaths felt shallower. My mind was floating, slipping away from the weight pressing into my skin, into my bones. I should have screamed, called for help. I didn't, because I already knew. No one would hear me. No one was coming. The pressure had become something distant, something separate from me. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. Couldn't tell if they were even still there. My mind wandered. Stupid thoughts. Random memories. The last time I'd had coffee. A joke someone had told me last week. The article I'd read about climate change, about heat waves swallowing cities, about people collapsing in streets while the rest of the world carried on, too far away to care. I thought about the way things ended. How quick it could be. How slow. Some deaths were sudden, like a car crash, a bullet, a fall from a height that gave you no time to think before the world turned black. Others dragged on. A slow suffocation. A drowning that stretched across minutes, hours. And then there were deaths like this. Deaths that happened in silence. In empty places. In the spaces between moments where no one was watching. I wasn't sure which was worse. The light was fading. The edges of my vision were blurring. My phone lay a few inches from my hand. Its screen cracked from where I'd dropped it. I wasn't scared anymore. That was the worst part. I should have been. I should have been terrified, desperate, clawing at the pavement, screaming for someone, anyone. But my mind was quiet now. The fear had drained away with the warmth in my limbs. The weight was still there, still pressing, but it was far away. Almost unimportant. I wasn't sure when my eyes closed. The last thing I felt was the cool breeze on my face. The last thing I heard was the sound of the wind, carrying the world forward without me. I used to stop by the little convenience store down the street almost every day. It wasn't anything special, a small, slightly worn-down place with a flickering neon sign out front. The same employees were always working there, and after a while, I got to know them pretty well. There was one cashier in particular, a woman named Sarah, who I talked to the most. She was around my age, maybe a little older, with short blonde hair and a round face that always seemed to be lit up by a smile. She was the kind of person who could turn a simple transaction into a full-blown conversation, and I always appreciated that about her. She loved to talk about her personal life, and I didn't mind listening. She especially loved to talk about my husband and me. Every time I came in, she'd ask how we were doing and tell me how cute we were together. Relationship goals, she'd say, giggling as she rang up my drink and snacks. I could tell she wanted that kind of love for herself. It wasn't long before she told me she had met someone. She gushed about him every day. His name was Mike, and according to her, he was perfect. He had come into her life at just the right time. She had 2 kids, both really young, and being a single mom was tough. But Mike was different. He stepped up and acted like a father to them almost immediately. He moved in within a few months, and they were already talking about having a baby together. She'd go on and on about how great he was with the kids, how he made them breakfast, played with them, and tucked them in at night. He's such a good dad, she'd say. They love him so much. At first, I thought it was sweet. A part of me worried about how fast it was moving, but she was happy. She was completely in love, and I wasn't going to be the person to bring her down. So, I smiled and told her I was happy for her. Then one night, I went in like usual. She was working the register, but something was different. She wasn't smiling. She barely even looked at me. She just stared down at the counter, rang up my drink, and handed me my change without a word. It was so unlike her that I almost asked if she was okay, but something about the way she looked stopped me. She wasn't just tired. She wasn't just having a bad day. Something was seriously wrong. The next night, she wasn't there. And the night after that, she still wasn't there. I didn't find out what had happened until later. The same night I had last seen her, her 5-year-old daughter had given Mike attitude, while Sarah was getting ready for work. That's how she later described it. Attitude. As if that justified what happened next. Mike had beaten the little girl so badly that she lost consciousness. He had laid her down on the couch, as if she were just a toy he had broken, and then he and Sarah had sat down to eat dinner. She knew what he had done, but she didn't do anything. She didn't take her daughter to the hospital. She didn't call for help. She just left for work. That was the same time I had seen her. The same time I had stood in front of her and tried to talk to her, completely unaware of what had just happened in her home. By midnight, Mike was blowing up her phone. The little girl wouldn't wake up. He kept calling, telling her to come home and deal with it. When she got home, her daughter was still unconscious. They tried to wake her up by putting her in the bath, splashing water on her face, shaking her. But nothing worked. And still, they didn't call for help. Not right away. Not until 3 in the morning, when they finally realized there was no hiding it anymore. By then, it was too late. She died in the hospital. The autopsy revealed everything. She had been covered in bruises, not just from that night, but from weeks, maybe even months of abuse. Some were fresh. Some were fading. Some were just beginning to heal. There were cuts, too, and bite marks, all over her body, even on places where no child should ever have wounds like that. And still, Sarah defended him. She told the police that he wasn't a bad guy, that he had just lost his temper, that it was an accident. Even as they laid out the evidence in front of her, even as they told her what had really been happening in her own home, she refused to believe it. She didn't just let it happen. She was complicit in it. I thought about all the times she had talked about him, all the times she had called him a good father, a perfect man, all the times she had looked me in the eyes and smiled while, behind closed doors, her child was suffering. I thought about the last time I had seen her, standing there at the register, completely silent, her face pale and expressionless. I had thought she was just having a bad day, but now I knew the truth. She wasn't sad because she had lost her daughter. She was sad because she had lost him. I never went back to that store again. I couldn't. Every time I thought about it, I thought about her standing behind the counter, smiling and laughing, telling me how happy she was. I thought about the little girl who had been suffering in silence while her mother pretended everything was perfect. And I thought about how I had stood there, completely unaware, just another customer making small talk while a child was dying. It was supposed to be just another college party. One of those nights where people packed into a small apartment. Music blared through cheap speakers, and the air smelled like cheap beer and sweat. The kind of night where you'd wake up the next morning with a pounding headache and a phone full of blurry photos. No one thought anything bad could happen. The apartment belonged to my friend, a girl we all knew well. Let's call her Rachel. She was always the one throwing parties, the one who never seemed to get tired. If you needed a place to crash, her couch was always open. If you ran out of beer, she had another case in the fridge. Her place wasn't big, just a small off-campus apartment with 2 bedrooms, but it was always full of people. That night, the party started like any other. Music, drinking, people laughing too loud, groups sitting on the floor playing drinking games, others standing in the kitchen talking about nonsense. I remember the sticky floors from spilled drinks and the way the air felt too hot from so many bodies packed into such a small space. I wasn't drunk, but I was tipsy enough to enjoy myself. I had no plans to stay the night. I lived close enough to walk home, but some people were planning to crash there, either in Rachel's spare room or on the couch. By around 1 or 2 a.m., the party started dying down. One by one, people said their goodbyes, stumbling out into the night, either walking home or calling an Uber. The music was turned off. Someone helped Rachel gather empty beer cans into a trash bag. Someone else wiped up a sticky mess from the counter. A couple of guys who had planned to crash there changed their minds at the last minute and left. By the time I left, only Rachel remained. She said she was exhausted and was heading straight to bed. Rachel wasn't a paranoid person. She wasn't the type to double-check the locks 3 times or look over her shoulder when walking home at night. She was independent, fearless. So when she finally dragged herself to bed that night, she didn't think twice about it. The party had ended, the apartment was quiet, and she was alone. She left the door to her bedroom cracked open, like she always did, just enough to let in a sliver of light from the living room. The apartment was still slightly warm from all the body heat, but she pulled the blanket up anyway, rolling onto her side, her mind already drifting into sleep. The thing about sleep is that it makes you vulnerable. When you're in that half-awake, half-dreaming state, your brain plays tricks on you. Sometimes, you hear sounds that aren't really there. You see shadows where there shouldn't be any. That's what Rachel thought was happening at first. She was in that in-between stage, not fully awake, not fully asleep, her body heavy with exhaustion. She turned over, adjusting her pillow, and for a moment, her eyes flickered open. That's when she saw it, a shadow at the foot of her bed. Her first thought was that it was a trick of the light. Maybe her eyes were playing games with her, the way darkness can sometimes take shape and make you think you're seeing something that isn't really there. But then it moved. A faint outline, a figure, a person. Rachel's heart slammed against her ribs. Her body locked up, her brain trying to process what she was seeing. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there watching. The moment stretched too long. Seconds, maybe more. A deep, awful silence filled the room. Then, without thinking, she screamed. As soon as the sound tore from her throat, the figure lunged. Not at her, toward the door. Rachel scrambled upright as the man bolted out of her bedroom, his dark shape vanishing into the hallway. She heard the front door jerk open, the slam of footsteps, and then nothing. Silence. She sat there, heart hammering, breath coming in ragged gasps, staring at the empty space where the figure had been standing. For the first time, she noticed the door to her bedroom had been opened wider. Had he been standing there, watching her sleep? How long? She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she checked the locks. They were still in place. The windows were still locked. There was no sign of forced entry. But someone had been inside. She went over every possibility. Had someone stayed behind after the party? Slipped into the bedroom without her noticing? Was it someone who had left and then come back, sneaking in when the apartment was empty? The thought made her stomach churn. She told me about it the next day, still shaken. She hadn't slept, hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. She said she felt sick knowing that someone had been inside her room, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her. She hadn't seen his face, hadn't been able to make out anything other than a dark silhouette. But it was real. The way he ran, the sound of his footsteps, there was no doubt. After that night, she started sleeping with a bat under her bed. She never left her bedroom door cracked open again. She moved out of that apartment the next semester. Not because of what happened. At least, that's what she told people, but I always suspected it had something to do with it. Because no matter how many times she checked the locks, No matter how many times she told herself it wouldn't happen again, the feeling never went away. That feeling of being watched. I've always loved amusement parks. The crowds, the smell of fried food, the distant roar of roller coasters cutting through the sky. It all felt like a second home to me. Every summer, my family made a trip to one of the biggest amusement parks in the country, the kind with a name that hinted at multiple flags. By the time I was 13 or 14, I had already been there more times than I could count. But there was one ride I loved more than the others. Viper. It was one of the park's older roller coasters, a massive wooden structure that groaned and rattled as it carried screaming riders through its course. It wasn't the tallest or fastest ride in the park, but it had this rough, raw energy that made it feel wilder than the newer, smoother steel coasters. The wooden frame vibrated with every turn, every drop. It felt alive in a way the modern coasters didn't. That day, I was there with my best friend. We had already gone on most of the big rides, but I had saved Viper for later in the afternoon, wanting to build up to my favorite. When we finally got in line, I remember feeling a little off. Not sick or tired, just off. Like something was nagging at the back of my mind, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I brushed it off. We reached the front of the line and climbed into the train. The seats were the same as I remembered, worn, a little uncomfortable, with a single lap bar to hold us in place. I pulled mine down and gave it a little shake to make sure it was locked. It held firm, just like it always did, but something felt different. The ride started, pulling us up the first hill with the familiar clanking of the chain lift. The view stretched out over the park, the tops of other roller coasters cutting through the sky. Normally, this was the part where excitement started building, where I felt that electric anticipation in my chest. But this time, that unease didn't go away. Halfway through the ride, I realized why. The seat beneath me was shaking. Not just the normal rattling that came with a wooden coaster, but an actual, noticeable movement. A looseness that shouldn't have been there. I shifted my weight, testing it. The seat gave a little. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me. I turned to my friend, who looked just as uneasy. I could tell he felt it too. The ride was still moving fast, twisting through turns, the wood creaking and groaning around us. I gripped the lap bar tighter. That's when the seat dropped. 1 second, we were sitting. The next, the bench beneath us gave way. The old, splintered wood snapping loose like it had just been waiting for the right moment. There was nothing beneath us now except open air and the steel floor of the coaster car, which was just a narrow strip between the rails. My legs dangled. Panic surged through me. The lap bar was the only thing keeping me in place. Instinct took over, and I scrambled, pressing my feet against the metal floor and gripping the bar with everything I had. My friend did the same. The coaster was still moving, still flying through its course like nothing was wrong. I had no idea how much longer the ride would last. I had never paid attention to its length before. Usually, I just enjoyed the thrill. But now every second stretched on. Every turn felt like it would be the one to send me flying out. I felt every bump in the track, every jolt. The floor of the car was smooth metal, and my feet kept slipping. My hands ached from holding the bar so tight, but I couldn't let go, not even for a second. Somewhere ahead, the ride was slowing down. The final brake run. I barely noticed the last turn. My entire focus was on holding on, keeping myself inside the car. The train hit the brakes hard, jerking us forward. For a terrifying moment, I thought the force would throw me out, but somehow, I stayed in place. Then, finally, the train rolled into the station. I was shaking. My arms, my legs, everything felt weak. The second the lap bar lifted, I grabbed the side of the car and pulled myself out. My friend did the same, both of us too stunned to say anything. We just got out and stumbled toward the exit. Nobody else had noticed. The workers were focused on loading the next riders. The people in line were chatting, excited for their turn. Nobody had seen what happened. I wanted to say something, to tell someone, to yell at the ride operators, to do anything. But I couldn't. I was still too shaken. My friend and I just walked, not stopping until we were far from the ride. Only later did it fully hit me. How close we had come to something much worse. If we hadn't stood up, if we hadn't reacted fast enough, if there had been another drop near the end. I didn't want to think about it. I never rode Viper again. Even now, years later, I wonder what happened to that seat. If anyone ever noticed. If it was fixed, or if it stayed loose, waiting for the next unlucky rider. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes, when I hear the sound of a wooden coaster rattling in the distance, I can still feel that moment, the seat giving way beneath me, the sheer, gut-wrenching terror of knowing there was nothing between me and the tracks except my own grip. And that's something I'll never forget. I have always preferred doing my shopping late at night. Not just late, but the kind of late that makes people shake their heads when I mention it. Midnight, 1 a.m., sometimes even later. There was just something peaceful about the empty aisles, the absence of crowds, and the general stillness of the world when most people were asleep. I didn't have to deal with long lines or screaming kids or people standing in the middle of the aisle staring at their phones. It was just me, the shelves, and the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. That night, I had decided to go a little later than usual, closer to 2 a.m. It wasn't unusual for me, but I remember feeling more tired than normal, which made me consider skipping the trip altogether. But I had already put it off for a couple of days, and I was running low on too many things to justify waiting any longer. I grabbed my keys, slipped on my shoes, and headed out the door. My apartment complex was small, tucked away just off a major road, which meant that getting in and out could be a pain sometimes. There was one traffic light at the exit that I absolutely hated. It was long, painfully long. If you missed the green, you could be sitting there for what felt like forever, especially at night when traffic was light, and the sensors didn't always seem to recognize a single car waiting. As I approached the intersection, I watched the light turn yellow and then red, just before I could reach it. I let out an annoyed sigh and rolled to a stop, knowing that I was in for a wait. It was just me at the light, the road around me completely empty. I idly drummed my fingers on the steering wheel, my other hand reaching for the volume knob on my radio. I had left it on a station that was playing nothing but songs I didn't care for, and with nothing else to do, I figured I might as well find something better. Click, click, static. Another station. Still nothing good. I kept my head down, glancing up at the light every now and then, knowing it wouldn't change for a while. The song on the next station was equally disappointing, and I was about to switch again when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The light had turned green. I sat up, gripping the wheel, about to press on the gas, but before I could move, a car blasted through the intersection. Not just ran the red light, blasted through it at an absolutely insane speed. It took a second for my brain to catch up with what had just happened. The car had been a sedan, dark-colored, no headlights. It shot through the red light so fast that it was almost a blur, the whoosh of air behind it rocking my car slightly. My foot was still hovering over the gas pedal. If I had been paying attention, if I had gone the moment the light turned green, that car would have hit me. And not just hit me, slammed into my driver's side at full speed. There wouldn't have been time to brake, to swerve, to react. Nothing. I would have been dead, or at the very least, mangled beyond recognition. I stared ahead at the now empty road, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. My heart was pounding, a delayed reaction finally catching up to me as my brain processed just how close I had come to never making it home. I took a deep breath, then another. The world was still quiet, still empty, still just me sitting there at the light, but everything had changed in an instant. I finally pressed on the gas, moving forward slowly, cautiously, as if expecting another car to come flying out of nowhere. But the road was empty. There was nothing. No sign of the reckless driver who had nearly killed me. I made it to the store without incident, though I was acutely aware of my surroundings in a way I hadn't been before. Every car that passed me, every set of headlights in my rearview mirror felt like a potential threat. I went through the motions of shopping, picking up the things I needed, but the entire time, my mind kept circling back to that moment at the intersection. The fact that I had been saved, not by my own alertness or quick thinking, but by sheer dumb luck. Or, more specifically, by the fact that I had been fiddling with my radio, delaying me just long enough to avoid being in the path of that speeding car. The thought made me shudder. By the time I got home and unloaded my groceries, I felt exhausted. More than just physically tired, mentally, emotionally drained. I stood in my kitchen for a moment, staring at nothing, then slowly sat down, still trying to process everything. If I had been paying attention to the light instead of the radio, I wouldn't be here right now. That single, random moment of distraction had saved my life. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that car barreling through the intersection, felt the phantom impact of what could have happened. The next time I went shopping, I went earlier. Not by much, but enough. And for the first time in years, I didn't mind dealing with a little bit of traffic. The air was heavy with the salty dampness of the sea, rolling in from the shore at Somerton Beach. It was December of 1948, and the wind cut through my coat as I walked along the sand, boots sinking slightly with each step. The sun had begun its slow descent beyond the horizon, casting an amber glow over the water. The waves lapped gently at the shore, oblivious to the secrets they concealed. I was there the evening they found the body. A man, neatly dressed, slumped against the sea wall as if he had merely dozed off. His posture seemed too composed for a corpse. He wore a suit pressed and clean, the cuffs showing no signs of wear, and his shoes gleamed unnaturally for someone who had supposedly wandered into his death. There was no identification, no wallet, nothing to say who he was or where he had come from. Just an odd, stitched repair on his trousers, done with a peculiar orange thread. The police were quick to move the body, covering him with a sheet before carrying him away. It was easy to pretend he had simply been a vagrant, but the details nagged at me. I wasn't the only one unsettled. Others whispered among themselves. There was something deliberate about the way he was found, something staged, something too neat. Weeks passed, and the city buzzed with speculation. The newspapers printed theories. Was he a spy? A lost traveler? Someone with a past too tangled to unravel? Then, at the Adelaide train station, an unclaimed suitcase was discovered. It had been left in a locker on the day before his body was found. Inside, carefully packed clothing. Shirts, trousers, even a shaving kit. And there, among the mundane items, was that same orange thread. I remember the way the newspapers latched onto this clue. The thread wasn't just rare. It couldn't even be purchased in Australia. It was a small detail, a whisper of something foreign, something calculated. But if he packed this suitcase himself, why had he no identification? Why did none of his clothes have labels? Why was there not a single scrap of paper that could link him to anything at all? The suitcase provided no new answers. If anything, it only deepened the mystery. Then months later, another strange twist. A man walked into the detective's office, holding a book. It was a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, an old book of Persian poetry. He claimed that on the night of the man's death, he and his brother had visited Somerton Beach. When they returned to their car, they found the book lying in the back seat. They had no idea how it got there. It was missing its final page. The last words of the book had been torn out. Tamam shud. Finished. It wasn't just missing. It was found in the dead man's pocket. Folded neatly, no signs of struggle, no blood. Just those words, the finality of them heavy in the air. Inside the book were 2 phone numbers. One was disconnected, nothing but dead air on the other end. The other led to a young nurse. She denied ever knowing the man, but when she was shown a cast of his face, her reaction was undeniable. Her breath caught, her eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked as if she might collapse. But she said nothing. She claimed to have given a copy of the book to a man named Alfred, but when the police followed up, they found him alive, with his own copy still intact. No one could explain where this book had come from. No one could say how it had ended up in the back of a stranger's car. And when the detectives placed the torn book under a blacklight, they found something even stranger, lines of code, faint, scribbled between the poetry. Letters arranged in a sequence no one could decipher. People tried. The best codebreakers, the brightest minds. No one could crack it. Theories spread like wildfire. Was he a spy? A smuggler? A man with a secret so heavy he carried it to the grave? The way he was dressed, the pristine condition of his shoes, the lack of any struggle, it all pointed to something planned, something meticulous. But then nothing. No new leads, no new names. Just the same lingering questions. The case grew cold. The body was buried without a name, and the suitcase gathered dust in an evidence locker. The book, the code, the phone numbers, they were all pieces of a puzzle that would never be solved. I still think about him sometimes. The man on the beach, the orange thread, the book with its missing page. I imagine the final moments of his life. Did he know what was coming? Did he sit there, staring at the sea, waiting for the inevitable? Was it his own hand that placed the paper in his pocket, or had someone else done it for him? The mystery never faded. Years passed, theories rose and fell, but the truth remained just out of reach. The final words of that book still haunt me. Tamam should. Finished. But we never really knew what ended that night. I was back home in Karachi, Pakistan. This was years before I moved to the UK. Our house was in a relatively quiet area. At least that's what we thought. We had no idea that just a short walk away, hidden behind high walls, was a CID building, the Criminal Investigation Department, something like the Pakistani version of the FBI. We all assumed it was just another government office, nothing special. That changed forever on November 11, 2010. It had been an ordinary workday. By evening, I felt exhausted, but instead of going straight home, I decided to hit the gym. It wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute walk, and I liked the sauna there. A good sweat sounded like a great way to shake off the day's fatigue. So, I changed quickly and stepped out onto the street. The walk was peaceful. The evening air had cooled slightly, and the usual city sounds filled the streets, cars honking, the distant shouts of vendors, the occasional laughter of children playing outside their homes. I had only walked about 10 minutes, maybe a little less than a quarter of a mile from my house, when something shifted. For a split second, I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. It was so quick that I almost thought I had imagined it. Then came the explosion. The blast was deafening, louder than anything I had ever heard in my life. It felt like the sky itself had cracked open. Before I could even process the sound, a violent pressure wave slammed into my chest, throwing me off my feet. It felt like being kicked by a giant, a force so powerful that I couldn't breathe for a moment. My ears felt like they had exploded from the inside, and within seconds, I could feel something warm trickling down my neck, blood. I hit the ground hard, rolling over dust and debris. The world around me spun. My ears rang so loudly that all other sounds became distant, muffled. For a few seconds, I couldn't think, couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Then, as the ringing in my ears subsided, the chaos of the world rushed back in. Car alarms were blaring everywhere. The ground was littered with shattered glass. People were screaming, some in terror, others in pain. As I struggled to sit up, I caught the scent of something that made my stomach turn. Gunpowder. Burning flesh. It was a smell I would never forget, a mix of chemicals, fire, and something horrifyingly human. Small chunks of debris were still raining down around me, tiny rocks and dust covering my clothes. But there was something else in the air, something that made my skin crawl. I looked down and saw it, a piece of flesh, maybe an inch or two long, stuck to my arm. My brain refused to process it at first. It was human, someone's skin. My stomach lurched, and I violently brushed it off, scrambling to my feet. I turned toward the source of the blast. Through the haze of dust and smoke, I saw devastation. A row of buildings had been obliterated. What had once been walls were now piles of rubble. The street had deep cracks running through it, as if the earth itself had been wounded. A few buildings that still stood had massive fissures along their walls, some with entire sections missing, gaping holes exposing the rooms inside. My feet moved on their own, pulling me toward the destruction. As I got closer, the full horror of what had happened became clear. People were lying on the ground, some barely moving, others completely still. Blood pooled in the cracks of the pavement, soaking into the dust. Cars were on fire, thick black smoke curling into the sky. I stepped over debris, glass crunching under my shoes, trying to take it all in. Then I saw the crater. It was massive, at least 10 feet deep and 30 feet wide. The entire CID building was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed. Gone. Where it had stood was now just a gaping hole, filled with water from burst pipes and God knows what else. The blast had vaporized concrete and steel, reducing the entire structure to nothing. All around it were bodies. Some were still intact, others not. I saw people missing limbs, some without legs, some without torsos. The realization that these were once living, breathing humans, now reduced to unrecognizable pieces, sent a shiver down my spine. A woman nearby was screaming and beating her own chest, her face twisted in agony. I followed her gaze and saw why. Her husband lay nearby, or at least what remained of him. His upper body was there, his face still visible, but everything below his ribs was gone. I took another step forward and saw him. A young man, maybe 18 or 20, lying face down on the ground. But his head was twisted toward me. His lifeless eyes were wide open, staring straight into mine. His feet were bent at an impossible angle, completely turned around. I couldn't look away. Even as the police and rescue teams arrived, even as more people flooded the area, I kept seeing him, his face burned into my memory. I don't know how long I stood there before finally turning away and making my way home. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't try to explain what I had seen. I just walked, every step feeling heavier than the last. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The young man with the twisted feet, staring at me. And it didn't stop there. For weeks, every night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I saw him standing in my hallway, just staring at me. He never moved, never spoke. Just stood there, watching, judging, a reminder of what I had seen, of what had happened. To this day, even the smallest bang, a loud car backfire, a heavy door slamming shut, sends me right back to that moment. The shockwave, the deafening sound, the smell of burning flesh. My wife sometimes notices when I tense up at sudden noises, but I never tell her everything. Instead, I just whisper a silent prayer that no one ever has to go through what I did. Some things stay with you forever. We went to that lake every summer. It was the best part of the year, something we counted down the days for. The cabins were tucked into thick woods, but the lake itself stretched wide and open, a blue mirror reflecting the sky. The campground had everything: a little beach, a dock where we tied up our boat, trails through the trees, even a tiny general store for bait and snacks. But for real groceries, we had to drive into town, a good 30 minutes away. That year, the trip started like every other. My dad and older siblings were busy unloading the truck, getting the boat in the water, and setting up our cabin. Meanwhile, my mom, my youngest brother, and I took the car and headed to town to stock up on food for the week. My brother was 4, I was 5, both of us just excited to be on vacation. It had started to rain as we drove, little drops pattering the windshield, turning the road dark and slick. I remember watching the trees blur past, feeling warm and safe in the car, listening to my mom hum along to the radio. By the time we reached town, the rain had picked up, heavy now, coming down in sheets. We parked as close as we could and made a run for the doors, laughing as the water soaked through our clothes. Inside, the store was bright and dry, the air smelling like floor cleaner and produce. We grabbed a cart and started working our way through the aisles, my mom tossing things in as we went. The usual stuff: bread, snacks, drinks. We stopped in the cereal aisle, and I was probably arguing over which box to pick when it happened. At first, it was just a sound, a deep, low rumbling that I thought was maybe a big truck going by. But it got louder. The whole store seemed to shake with it, like the walls were vibrating. The lights flickered. My mom grabbed us both, one arm around me, one around my brother, and suddenly we were on the floor, her body covering ours. Then everything exploded. It was chaos. Shelves tipped. Glass shattered. The world turned into flying metal and cardboard and food. Something heavy hit my back, knocking the air out of me. I remember squeezing my eyes shut, my arms over my head, the noise so loud it felt like my ears would burst. The wind was inside the store, screaming through it, picking things up, throwing them, tearing the world apart. I heard people yelling, the sound broken and scattered like it was being ripped away before it could even form words. The lights went out completely, leaving everything in eerie flashes of gray and black as lightning flickered outside. The entire cereal shelf crashed backward, and suddenly, the aisle we were in wasn't an aisle anymore. It was just a mess of food and twisted metal and broken glass. My mom was still holding us, still keeping us covered, but I could feel her shaking. It might have been seconds. It might have been minutes. Time wasn't real in that moment. There was just noise and destruction, and then just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. The silence after was almost worse. The air felt wrong, thick and charged, like something had been ripped away. It smelled like dust and rain and something sharp, like metal and plastic burned together. People were crying, calling out for each other. I heard a baby screaming. My brother was sobbing against my mom's chest. My own hands were shaking so bad I could barely move them. The store was wrecked. The front windows were gone, shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces across the floor. Shelves had been thrown around like toys, food and debris scattered everywhere. Parts of the ceiling had collapsed, letting the storm's gray light in. The parking lot outside was unrecognizable, cars flipped, trees splintered. But somehow, miraculously, everyone inside was alive. Rescue workers showed up not long after. Paramedics moved through the wreckage, checking on people, patching up cuts, making sure no one was trapped. We were all banged up, bruised, scratched, but nothing serious. We were lucky. I remember sitting outside on the curb, wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, watching the rain slow to a drizzle. My mom held on to us like she'd never let go again. 2 hours passed before we could leave. Our car, somehow untouched in all of it, sat there like nothing had happened. My mom drove us back to the lake, her hands tight on the wheel, the drive quiet except for my brother sniffling in the back seat. I stared out the window, my head still spinning, the world still feeling unreal. When we pulled into the campground, it was like stepping into another world. The sky was clear, the air fresh and calm. The storm had never reached the lake. My dad and older siblings were in the water, splashing, laughing, completely unaware of what had just happened. It felt impossible, like we had lived through something that didn't even belong to this place. My mom parked, got out, and as soon as she saw my dad, she started crying. She had held it together through all of it, but now it all came pouring out. My dad ran to her, confused, asking what was wrong, and we tried to explain all at once, me, my brother, my mom, our voices overlapping, barely making sense. We stayed. The lake was safe. The campground had tornado shelters, and the worst had already passed. The rest of the week, the weather was perfect, not a single storm cloud in sight. But everything felt different. My mom and dad drove back into town the next day to see what was left. The little grocery store was barely standing. The rest of the town was even worse. Buildings gone, homes destroyed, people picking through what was left of their lives. It was heartbreaking. They rebuilt. By the next summer, the store was standing again, the town put back together. But I never forgot. The sound, the feeling of everything being ripped apart around us. The helplessness. After that, every storm made my stomach twist, made my hands shake just a little. Even years later, even knowing we had survived, the fear never really left. I don't remember much about the day we hired her. It must have been sometime in early June, and I doubt I paid much attention to the details of the interview. She was just supposed to be a receptionist, someone to answer phones, file paperwork, and greet visitors. The kind of job that doesn't require much thought when you're trying to fill it. What I do remember is that she made an immediate impression on everyone. She was an older woman, mid-60s maybe, with that warm, grandmotherly charm that made you feel comfortable around her. Her name was Helen. She wore soft pastel cardigans over floral blouses, had her hair set in neat curls, and always had a pleasant, easy smile. The kind of person you'd trust without a second thought. She brought in baked goods almost every day. Cookies, brownies, lemon bars, apple cobbler. She was always coming in with something wrapped in foil or packed neatly in Tupperware. She told us that her husband, Jim, had a terrible sweet tooth, and since their kids had all moved out, she always ended up making too much. She figured we might as well enjoy the extra. I never thought much of it at the time. It just seemed like a sweet thing to do. She also talked about Jim a lot. I never met him, but from the way she described him, he sounded like a funny guy. She'd tell us little stories about something he said the night before, or some ridiculous thing he did. Like the time he forgot he left his glasses on his forehead and spent 20 minutes searching for them. Or the time he tried to fix their broken washing machine and ended up flooding the laundry room. We all laughed. We all ate the cookies. We all thought she was just the sweetest old lady. But she wasn't. I never noticed anything strange about her at first. Looking back, though, there were little things. Small details that didn't seem important at the time. She never seemed in a hurry to go home. Most employees were out the door at 5 on the dot, but Helen? She lingered. Sometimes she'd stay back to straighten up the reception desk. Other times she'd just sit in the break room, sipping tea and reading a magazine. It didn't seem strange back then. Some people just don't like sitting home alone. She also never really took days off. That was unusual for someone her age. No doctor's appointments, no sick days. Even when she caught a bad cold in July, she still showed up, sniffling and coughing, insisting she felt fine. And then there was her car. A beige sedan, older but well-kept. It was always parked in the same spot at the far end of the lot. I never saw her open the trunk. Never saw her put groceries in it or take anything out. But that wasn't something I would have noticed at the time. Why would I? I did notice one thing, though. Something small, something that only stood out in hindsight. One day in August, she offered me a ride home. My car was in the shop, and it was pouring rain. She was standing by the office door, holding her umbrella, and I was debating whether to call a cab. "You need a ride, dear?" she asked, smiling as always. I almost said yes, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way she stood there, like she was waiting just a little too eagerly. Or maybe it was nothing at all. Just instinct. I told her I had already called a cab, and thanked her anyway. I'll never forget the way her smile faltered. Just for a second. It was a Monday when the police showed up. I got to the office early that morning, like I always did. The air smelled like coffee and printer ink, and Helen was already at her desk, smiling like she always did. There was a tray of oatmeal raisin cookies on the counter next to her. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when I saw the cop cars pull into the lot. 2 of them, rolling in slow, lights off. That's when I saw Helen stand up. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She just stood there, her hands resting on the desk, and watched as the officers stepped out of their cars. They walked straight into the office, asked for her by name. What happened next is a blur. I remember them asking her to come with them. I remember her nodding, like she had been expecting it. I remember her putting on her coat, calmly, without a word. And then she was gone. I don't know how long we sat there after she left. 10 minutes. An hour. The whole office was silent, staring at the front doors, waiting for someone to tell us what the hell was going on. We didn't get the full story until later. Jim's kids had reported him missing. They hadn't heard from him since Christmas, and every time they asked Helen about it, she was evasive. Said he was sick, said he was sleeping, said he was out running errands. Eventually, they got worried enough to call the police. The cops started looking into it, checked phone records, credit card activity, found nothing. Jim hadn't used his bank account in months. He hadn't called anyone. He hadn't been seen anywhere. So they went to the house. Helen let them in, all smiles, all warmth. Told them Jim had just stepped out. Offered them tea. But something didn't feel right. They asked to look around. She let them. And that's when they checked the garage. That's when they found the trunk. It was his. Jim's. A large old trunk, tucked into the back corner. And inside, pieces. He had been cut into sections. Arms, legs, torso, all wrapped up in plastic and shoved inside. The smell must have been unbearable. The police arrested her on the spot. Later, after they questioned her, they learned the truth. On Christmas night, she had slit his throat while he was sleeping. Then, over the next few hours, she used a hacksaw to cut him up. She rolled the pieces up in a carpet, dragged them to the garage, stuffed them into the trunk, and then she went on with her life. She came to work every morning. She baked cookies. She told us funny stories about Jim, laughing, smiling, acting like nothing had happened. For 8 months, his body sat in that trunk, rotting, and the whole time, we had no idea. The office was never the same after that. Helen had been such a presence, so warm and familiar, that the truth of what she had done shook us to the core. Nobody wanted to sit in the break room anymore. Nobody wanted to park near her old spot. For weeks, we kept talking about it, trying to make sense of it, but we never could. I kept thinking about all the times she had handed me a cookie with that sweet smile, telling me about something Jim had said the night before. I kept thinking about how she had offered me a ride home that day. Would I have smelled it? Would I have heard something in the trunk? Would she have done something if I had accepted? I don't know. What I do know is this. The entire time I knew her, Jim's body was in that trunk. She had already killed him, and she never stopped smiling. The road stretched ahead of me, narrow and cracked, the edges crumbling into dirt and grass. The headlights cut through the darkness, the beams bouncing slightly with each imperfection in the pavement. It was nearly 2 a.m., and the only light besides my car came from the moon, a pale, heavy glow hanging low over the fields. Beside me, my friend sat with her arms crossed, staring out the window. She was tired, same as me. We'd been driving for hours, coming back from a karate tournament out of state, and I just wanted to get home. The exhaustion sat deep in my bones, making my hands feel slow on the wheel, but I had to stay alert. We were in the middle of nowhere, nothing but farmland and dense patches of woods for miles. No gas stations, no houses with porch lights, just the occasional mailbox standing on the side of the road like a forgotten marker. I was going maybe 5 miles over the speed limit, not too fast, but enough to make sure we kept moving. No point in lingering out here longer than we had to. I took a left onto another back road, one that would take us closer to my friend's house. As I made the turn, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. A pair of headlights flicked on at the intersection behind me. A car had just pulled onto the road. I didn't think much of it. It wasn't weird for someone else to be driving this late, especially in the country. Probably just another late-night traveler, maybe a trucker or someone heading home from a long shift. I kept driving, letting the road guide me. A minute passed. Then two. The car behind me didn't fall back. Instead, it sped up, closing the distance between us until its headlights were blinding in my rearview mirror. I frowned, gripping the steering wheel tighter. What the hell was this guy doing? There was no reason for anyone to ride my bumper like that, especially not out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour. I glanced at my speedometer. 55 mph, that was plenty fast for a road like this, especially with all the cracks and potholes. If the driver wanted to go faster, they could just pass me. There was plenty of room, no other cars, no obstacles. But they didn't. They just stayed there, hovering inches from my back bumper, their high beams flooding the inside of my car with light. I felt my stomach tighten. My friend shifted in her seat. I pressed the gas pedal down, easing up to 60, then 65. The car stuck to me like glue. 70. Still there. I felt my pulse in my throat, steady and heavy. This isn't normal. This wasn't some impatient driver. They were keeping up with me on purpose. I swallowed hard and tried to keep my breathing steady. Maybe they were drunk. Maybe they didn't realize how close they were. Maybe. The car lurched forward. It surged up even closer, less than a foot from my bumper, its grille so close I could see the outline in my mirror. My hands clenched the wheel. They were doing this on purpose. I hit the gas. 75. 80. Asterisk, asterisk, the car didn't let up. My friend finally spoke. What the hell are they doing? I didn't answer. I just focused on the road. I took a sharp turn, the back tires skidding slightly on the loose gravel at the edge of the pavement. I hoped the sudden movement would shake them, maybe make them hesitate. But the moment I straightened out, they were right back on me. I pressed the gas harder. 85. The car stayed glued to me. My chest was tight, my breathing fast. This isn't random. This isn't an accident. Asterisk, asterisk, whoever was in that car was hunting us. My friend sat stiffly beside me, eyes locked on the mirror. I could feel the tension radiating off her. She wasn't panicking, not yet, but she was just as scared as I was. The road twisted ahead, and I had to slow down just a little, just enough to make the turn without spinning out. I took it tight, the wheels groaning against the pavement. The car stayed with me. My mind raced. What do they want? Were they trying to run me off the road? Rob us? Kidnap us? Worse, there were no streetlights, no nearby houses where we could pull in and get help. We were trapped on these roads, just me, my friend, and the psycho behind us. We kept going like that for what felt like an eternity, speeding down cracked asphalt, twisting through back roads, taking sharp turns, doing everything I could to shake them. But no matter what I did, they never let off. 30 minutes passed, then 40. My arms ached from gripping the wheel so hard. My heartbeat was a constant, frantic thud in my ears. My friend held her phone in her lap, fingers hovering over it. We thought about calling the cops, but what if we had no service? What if they couldn't get here in time? What if stopping to talk to a dispatcher gave this guy the chance to do whatever he was planning to do? I didn't slow down. My friend's house was getting close. Too close. I couldn't lead this guy straight there. Her driveway was long, dark, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. If I pulled in, we'd be trapped. No neighbors. No witnesses. No way to escape. I felt sick. What the hell do I do? Then, up ahead, I saw it. A stop sign. The road split here. One lane led to her house. The other curved back toward our hometown. I pressed the brakes, slowing just enough to make the stop. My chest was so tight I could barely breathe. The psycho pulled up beside me. The headlights were so bright I couldn't see the driver. My pulse was a hammer. I felt my fingers brush the ice pick in the glove box, the pocket knife in my purse. If they got out, I'd have seconds, asterisk, asterisk, maybe asterisk, asterisk, to react. The car inched forward. The angle shifted. And then, I saw the writing. White block letters, stamped on the door. County Sheriff's Deputy. I stared. My breath caught in my throat. The car hesitated for half a second, just long enough for my brain to process what I was seeing. Then it pulled away. It didn't stop. Didn't roll down the window. Didn't acknowledge what had just happened. It just turned toward town and disappeared into the darkness. I sat there, hands shaking, unable to move. My friend was just as still, her breath uneven. The reality settled in. A cop. A cop had done this. There was no reason for it. No sirens. No lights. No attempt to pull me over. Just relentless, silent pursuit. For 45 minutes. My whole body was shaking as I finally turned onto my friend's road. I didn't speed anymore. I just drove in silence, my skin crawling. That night, I lay awake long after I got home. I kept replaying it in my head. The headlights. The way he never passed. The way he stayed on me through every turn, every mile, matching my speed no matter what I did. I thought about what could have happened, what he might have been hoping for. And I thought about how, if I hadn't seen that writing, I would have never known. I was 9 years old, and summer felt endless. Our street was the kind of place where kids rode bikes until the streetlights flickered on, where parents sat on porches sipping iced tea, where neighbors knew each other by name. My brothers and I spent most of our time outside, kicking a ball around or making up games with whatever sticks and rocks we could find. We weren't allowed to go far, but we didn't need to. Our whole world fit within that little stretch of pavement. That evening, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. My mom sat on the porch, keeping an eye on us like she always did, while my brothers and I ran up and down the street, playing some game that didn't have any real rules. I remember the way the air smelled, warm pavement, fresh-cut grass, the faintest hint of charcoal from someone grilling down the block. That's when we saw him, a man walking a golden retriever. The dog caught my brother's attention first. My middle brother, the 10-year-old, loved dogs more than anything. He ran straight toward it without hesitation. The man slowed, letting my brother kneel and pet it. The dog wagged its tail, panting happily, while my brother cooed over how soft its fur was. My older brother and I hung back a little watching. The man was friendly. He looked normal, average, just another guy in a t-shirt and jeans. His smile was easy, and he talked to us like he already knew us. He told us he was new here, that he was just checking out his house being built down the street. He said he'd be moving in soon, just a few houses down from ours. It was casual, harmless conversation. I didn't think much of it at the time, but my mom must have heard him from the porch, because her voice called us back. She was always careful about things like that. We groaned but obeyed, shuffling toward her. The man followed, still chatting, introducing himself. When he got to the porch, he made an offer. He was heading to check out the house now, and we could come along if we wanted. He said it like it was no big deal, like it was something fun, something exciting. My 10-year-old brother was already half in love with that dog and started pleading immediately. I remember the way my mom's expression didn't change much, just a small, polite smile. She told him no, that we had to go inside for dinner. My brother whined, argued, even threw himself on the ground in frustration, but my mom didn't budge. She thanked the man, told him good luck with his house, and ushered us inside. I didn't think about him after that. A week passed, and life went on. More summer evenings, more games in the street, more lazy afternoons spent in the backyard. I barely remembered the man or his dog. But one evening, my mom sat us down in the living room, her face tight and serious. She had a newspaper in her hands. I didn't understand what I was looking at first. There was a picture of him, the same man, same easy smile, same normal-looking face. But the words under the photo were different. Dark, ugly. He had been arrested. Not for anything small, not for stealing or fighting or some mistake. For hurting kids. For finding them, tricking them, taking them. The article laid it out in plain words, words that made my stomach drop. He had done this before, in other neighborhoods. The dog was the bait, the friendly face, the thing that made kids like my brother trust him. I read the words over and over, my mind stuck on one thing. It could have been us. If my mom had been inside, if she hadn't been paying attention, if we had been just a little farther from the house, if we had said yes. I felt sick. My 10-year-old brother was quiet, his eyes on the picture. I don't think he really understood. Not fully. I don't think any of us did. But I saw the way my mom looked at us, the way she pulled us in a little closer than usual, the way she checked the street before letting us out to play the next day. After that, the street didn't feel quite the same. It was still home, still safe, but there was something else now, something we hadn't known before. A weight, a sharp edge to things. We had been lucky. That's all it was. Luck. Nothing more. I never wanted to remember that day. For years, I tried to push it out of my mind, but some things don't fade. Some memories live under your skin, burrow into the deepest corners of your thoughts, waiting to surface when you least expect them. The sound of sirens, the smell of diesel and burning rubber, the sight of something so unnatural that your brain refuses to process it. It all stays. I never wanted to remember, but I do. I was on the road when it happened. The day had been clear, no rain, no wind, just a still, ordinary afternoon. I was driving back from an assignment, nothing remarkable. I had the radio on, one of those usual chatter-filled Sunday programs, voices laughing about some local politics, a song cutting in between conversations. The kind of background noise that fills the quiet of an empty car. Then the static. Then the voice. There's been an accident on the Vale of Tempe Highway. A collision between a truck and a passenger bus. Emergency responders are on their way. They didn't know yet. Nobody knew yet. But I was close. Too close. When I reached the stretch of road, I saw the flashing red and blue lights before anything else. Police, ambulances, fire trucks. A mess of emergency workers moving fast, too frantic. There was a thickness in the air, something more than just heat. It was the smell. That was the first thing that made my stomach twist. Not just gasoline, not just metal. Something worse. And then I saw the bus. Or what was left of it. The truck had hit it broadside, the force so violent it had torn the bus open. But that wasn't the worst part. The truck had been carrying chipboard, thick, heavy sheets stacked in its trailer. One had come loose, maybe from the impact, maybe in the seconds before, and when the collision happened, it had sliced through the bus like a guillotine. My brain refused to process it at first. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a vision so horrifying that my body shut down, refusing to believe it was real. The front of the bus was mostly intact, the windshield shattered, the metal twisted, but still recognizable. The back half was a different story. The chipboard had sheared through, cutting across the seats. There was no way to describe it without sounding like I was exaggerating, but I wasn't. Bodies, pieces, blood smeared across the road, soaking into the asphalt. Clothes shredded, school bags scattered in the dirt. The silence was the worst part. You'd expect screaming, crying, the usual chaos of an accident, but there was almost nothing. The people still alive were too stunned, too broken to make a sound. The ones who weren't, they would never make a sound again. The firefighters worked fast, but what could they do? The damage was done. Some students had been thrown from the wreck, lying crumpled on the roadside, but most of them had been sitting right where the chipboard cut through. I walked forward without thinking. The ground was slick under my feet. I stepped on something soft, and I didn't look down. I didn't want to know. One of the paramedics stopped me before I got too close. "You don't want to see this," he said, but his voice was hollow. I already had. There were 16-year-olds on that bus. Teenagers. Kids. On their way back from a school trip. Probably tired. Probably laughing. Probably talking about stupid things that seemed important in the moment. None of them had any idea that a truck with faulty brakes, carrying an unstable load, was about to end their lives in a way so violent that even the first responders would struggle to comprehend it. The hours blurred. More ambulances arrived, more reporters, more police officers trying to control the scene. Parents began showing up, their faces twisted with something I can't even describe, something beyond grief, beyond fear. Some of them ran to the bodies, screaming names. Some of them fell to their knees, unable to even speak. The numbers started coming in. 21 dead, 9 injured. It didn't seem real. How could that many kids just be gone? In an instant? How could something so random, so meaningless, take so much away? A priest showed up. I don't know who called him, but he started praying over the bodies. His voice was steady, but I could see his hands shaking. The firefighters kept working, carefully pulling apart the wreckage, but there was nothing left to save. Only things to recover. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the radio still playing inside my car. The same station, the same program, still going like nothing had happened. The world kept moving, traffic still passed on the other side of the highway, the sun still shone. But in that place, on that road, time had stopped. The next few days were a blur. The news spread fast, covering every channel, every newspaper. Faces of the victims appeared on TV screens. Smiling school photos turned into memorials overnight. Vigils were held in their hometowns. 21 funerals, 21 graves. The whole country felt it. You could see it in people's eyes, in the way strangers spoke to each other, softer, slower, like they were afraid of breaking something fragile. It wasn't just another accident. It was something worse. Something that left a hole so deep that it could never be filled. I tried to write about it. I tried to put into words what I had seen, what it had done to me, but nothing seemed right. How do you describe something like that? How do you make people understand the weight of it? Years passed, and I still couldn't forget. Every time I drove past that stretch of road, I saw it again. The bus, the wreckage, the blood. I heard the silence. Some things never leave you. Some things shouldn't. They built a memorial on that road, a small plaque with the names of the students who died that day. I visit sometimes. I stand there and read their names, and I wonder what they would have become. Doctors, teachers, artists, parents. They were supposed to have futures. But all they got was April 13th, 2003. And that day never ended for them. I was 12 years old the day my father died. It was a Wednesday, a school day, which made it strange from the start. Hunting was something we did on weekends, never in the middle of the week. My father had always been strict about that. School came first, and if my grades ever dropped, hunting was the first thing I would lose. But that week, he told me we were going on Wednesday. There was no explanation, no mention of school, just that we were going. Something in my gut told me that something was wrong, but I was too young to understand why. That morning, everything felt different. It was still dark when we left the house, and I watched from the truck as my father kissed my mother goodbye. It wasn't the usual quick peck as he rushed out the door. He held her face for a second longer than normal, whispered something to her, then turned and walked away. I sat there in the truck, gripping my hands together, trying to shake the cold feeling in my stomach. He wasn't wearing his Mason ring. He never took it off. But today his hand was bare. We drove in silence for over an hour. The heater in the truck was on, but I still felt cold. My father seemed distant, his hands tight on the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. I wanted to ask him why we were hunting on a Wednesday, why he seemed so different, but I kept my mouth shut. I had learned a long time ago that my father wasn't the kind of man you questioned. The sun had barely started to rise when we reached the hunting ground. It was a private piece of land, rented just for us, so there wouldn't be anyone else around. I stepped out of the truck and pulled my coat tighter around me. The air was sharp and cold, and the ground was covered in a thin layer of frost. My father grabbed his shotgun and motioned for me to follow. The walk to our usual spot was tough. We had to wade through water that had frozen over during the night. My father led the way, breaking the ice with each step, while I stayed close behind. The sound of cracking ice echoed through the still morning, mixing with the occasional distant call of a bird. The water was freezing against my legs, and my boots felt heavy with every step. We finally reached the levee, but it was too late to make it to the blind. The sun was breaking, and the ducks were already taking off. My father didn't waste any time. He lifted his shotgun and started shooting. The sound of gunfire filled the air, sharp and deafening in the early morning silence. He fired again and again, his face set in deep concentration. Then he hit one. The bird dropped from the sky, landing in the water with a soft splash. "Go get it," he told me. I nodded, stepping forward to wade back into the icy water. Just as I was about to take my first step, a gunshot rang out. Not from my father's gun. It was different, louder, closer. I turned around just in time to see my father drop his shotgun. He staggered backward, one hand clutching his chest, the other gripping his coat. He looked at me for a second, just a second, and then he started running. I didn't understand what was happening. My feet felt frozen to the ground. Then I saw the blood. It was dark against his coat, spreading quickly. My father was shot. I ran after him, calling his name, but he didn't answer. He made it a few more steps before his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the ground. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking as I tried to get him to talk. He was breathing, but it was weak, shallow. His eyes were open, staring past me, past the sky, past everything. I didn't know what to do. I was just a kid. There was no one around, no one to help. My father's gun lay forgotten in the dirt. The ducks were still flying overhead. the morning still moving forward as if nothing had happened. I wanted to scream, to cry, but there wasn't any time for that. I had to find help. I took off running. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from there, had to find someone. The forest was endless, the trees all looking the same. My breath came in ragged gasps, my chest burning, my legs aching. I ran and ran, pushing past branches, tripping over roots, my body fueled by nothing but fear. After what felt like forever, I finally found someone. A man, a hunter maybe, standing near the edge of a clearing. I couldn't even get the words out. I just grabbed his hand and pulled, trying to get him to follow me. He asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. I just kept pulling, desperate to get back to my father. But when we reached the trees again, I realized something terrible. I was lost. I couldn't find my way back. The trees looked different, the ground unfamiliar. Panic clawed at my chest as I spun in circles, trying to remember which way I had come. The man told me to keep running, that he would go another way, and we would call for my father. So I ran again, my legs barely holding me up, my body aching with exhaustion. At some point, my body gave up. I don't remember falling, just the feeling of the ground against my face, the way my vision faded to black. When I woke up, the sun was high in the sky. My head was pounding, my mouth dry. I didn't know where I was, only that I had to keep going. Then I heard it, the sound of a helicopter overhead. I pushed myself up, forcing my legs to move, following the direction it was going. I stumbled into a clearing where a cabin stood, surrounded by a few cars. A sheriff was standing nearby. When they saw me, everything happened fast. They asked me questions over and over, the same ones again and again. How did it happen? Who shot him? Did I see anything? But I didn't have answers. I hadn't seen anything. I hadn't understood anything. They took me to the hospital, where they told me my uncle was coming. I sat in the waiting room, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of everything. Then my uncle arrived. He talked to the doctor for a moment before turning to me and waving me over. We didn't go inside. We just left. That was when I knew my father was gone. That was the day everything changed. The day I lost the person who had shaped my life. The person whose expectations had weighed on me, but who had also been my guide. I was 12 years old. And now, 60 years later, not a single night has passed without me dreaming of that morning. I never went hunting again. I never found out who fired that shot. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it wasn't. But I will never forget the way my father looked at me before he ran. The way he fell, the way I ran until I collapsed, lost and afraid. Some memories never fade. Some moments stay with you forever. And that day, that morning in the cold and the dark, will always be with me. I don't remember that day, not the way my mother does. She told me about it when I was older, maybe 12 or 13, when she thought I was old enough to hear the story without getting scared. I wasn't sure how to feel about it then, and I'm still not sure now, but she swears by it, and she has the video to prove it. I was 3 years old. My mother was 20. She was young, barely an adult, still adjusting to the reality of raising a child on her own most of the time. My father worked long shifts and was gone before I woke up, home after I was in bed. Most of my childhood memories are just of me and my mother. She had a lot on her plate, always cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, making sure I was safe and fed and happy. She was careful with me, protective, always double-checking locks, and making sure I stayed inside unless she was with me. We lived in a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Just a few houses down the street was where Lily lived. She was a neighbor kid, a little older than me, maybe 5 or 6. My mother says I loved playing with her, that every afternoon I would beg to go to Lily's house. We would play in her backyard, running around with dolls or just sitting in the dirt, making up games only little kids understand. I don't remember any of it, not really. I only know what my mother told me. Lily died. I didn't know. No one told me. She got sick, something sudden, unexpected. It happened fast, and before anyone really understood how serious it was, she was gone. It was a shock to the neighborhood. My mother told me years later that she was in tears when she heard the news. I think she assumed I wouldn't understand, that I wouldn't notice Lily was missing. After all, I was only 3. A few days passed. My mother was home alone with me. She had locked the doors, as she always did. She had to keep me inside, had to keep me safe. I was a curious child, always wandering, always trying to find something new to play with. She had learned to keep the keys out of reach, hidden where I couldn't find them. She thought that was enough. It wasn't. She left me alone for just a few minutes. Just enough time to put away laundry, to clean up something in the kitchen. When she came back, the house was silent. Too silent. She called my name. No answer. She checked my room. Empty. The bathroom empty. Her heart started racing. She ran to the front door, saw it standing open. The keys, the ones she always hid, were in the lock. I was gone. She ran outside, looking up and down the street, calling my name, panic rising in her chest. Then she heard it. Laughter. Quiet, happy, coming from the yard next door. She rushed over, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. When she turned the corner and stepped into the neighbor's backyard, she saw me. I was sitting in the grass, playing with dolls, laughing, chatting in that way little kids do when they're deep in play. She stood frozen, watching me, something cold creeping up her spine. I was alone. I shouldn't have been there. The yard was empty. Lily's family wasn't home. There were no toys left outside, nothing to play with. But I sat there, happy, completely unaware of my mother's fear. She approached slowly, trying to keep her voice steady as she asked me what I was doing. I didn't even look up at her. I just kept playing, smiling. She asked again. This time, I answered, playing dollies with Lily. She stopped cold. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She wanted to believe it was just imagination, that I was playing pretend, that I didn't understand what had happened. But something about the way I spoke, the way I laughed at nothing, sent chills through her. She pulled out her phone and started filming. She needed my father to see. She needed proof, needed someone else to tell her she wasn't going crazy. The video was short, shaky. In it, I sit cross-legged in the grass, giggling, my tiny hands moving as if I'm handing something back and forth, talking to someone who isn't there. My mother's voice, tight with nerves, asks me who I'm playing with. I answer easily, like it's obvious. Lily. She asks again, her voice shaking. Who? Lily. We're playing dollies. There's nothing there. Just me and empty air. She turns the camera, showing the yard, panning around to prove it. No one else is there. Just a quiet, empty yard and a little girl who shouldn't have been able to open the door, sitting in the grass and playing with a friend who was gone. She stopped recording and grabbed me, lifting me into her arms and carrying me home. She locked the door, double-checking it 3 times. Then she called my father. I don't remember what happened after that. Maybe I cried when she made me stop playing. Maybe I was confused when she looked at me with fear in her eyes. All I know is that she kept that video, and when she showed it to my father, he went pale. He didn't know what to say. They never told me about Lily until I was much older. They never showed me the video until I was almost a teenager. When I saw it, I didn't know what to think. It was strange, eerie, but I couldn't explain it. I had no memory of that day, no memory of playing in that yard. But there I was on film, smiling, laughing, talking to someone who wasn't there. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in anything supernatural. But I do believe that kids don't always understand things the way adults do. Maybe I was just pretending. Maybe I hadn't realized Lily was gone. Maybe my young mind had created something to fill the space where she used to be. Or maybe, in that moment, I just wasn't ready to let her go. Whatever the truth is, my mother never let me out of her sight again. And to this day, she keeps the video, just in case. I used to know someone named Rachel. She was the kind of person who made you believe in goodness. The kind of person who could walk into a room and brighten it without trying. She was soft-spoken but never afraid to speak up when it mattered. She cared about people in a way that felt rare, genuine, unselfish. She was just that type of person. I had a crush on her, but that's not the point. The point is, she was someone worth knowing. Someone worth remembering. Rachel's mom owned a small shop in the same strip mall where I worked. It wasn't much, just a handful of businesses lined up next to each other in a place where people came and went. Her mom's shop was right next to mine, so Rachel and her mom stopped by often. It became a routine. Some days, she'd just pop in for a minute, standing by the counter with a smile, talking about nothing and everything all at once. Other times, she'd stay longer, chatting with me and my co-workers, laughing at stupid jokes, talking about what she wanted to do with her life. Her brother, Tony, was different. He was younger, 13 or so. He interned at the shop I worked at for a little while, and I remember thinking he was a smart kid, smarter than most his age, but quiet. He had this way about him, this mild-mannered, soft-spoken nature. He was polite, respectful, never caused any trouble. I never would have imagined what he was capable of. None of us would have. That night, I wasn't there. I wasn't anywhere near their house. I only heard about it after it happened, after the damage was already done, after Rachel was already gone. She had been watching TV. Just an ordinary night, sitting downstairs, probably lost in some show or maybe scrolling through her phone. No reason to feel unsafe. No reason to think anything bad could happen. Tony walked down the stairs with a gun in his hand. I don't know if she saw him coming. I don't know if she turned her head, if she realized what was happening in time. Maybe she did. Maybe there was a split second of recognition, some moment where she understood what was about to happen. Or maybe it was too fast. Maybe she didn't know at all. He shot her. Not once. Not twice. Multiple times. I don't know how many bullets. I don't know where they hit. I never asked. I don't want to know. All I know is that Rachel died right there. Her brother, her own flesh and blood, had pulled the trigger. And he wasn't done. He started walking upstairs, gun still in his hand, heading for his parents. Maybe he was going to shoot them too. Maybe he had planned it all along, or maybe it was something else, something even he didn't understand. But he didn't get that far. Somehow his father stopped him. I don't know how, only that he managed to wrestle the gun from Tony's hands before he could fire another shot. I can only imagine the terror of that moment. Tony's father realizing what his son had done, realizing what he was about to do. The struggle, the weight of it all crashing down. When they asked Tony why he did it, he said he didn't know. That was it. No anger, no grief, no regret. Nothing. His eyes were empty. No emotion, no guilt, no sadness. Just nothing. I keep thinking about Rachel. How she was just there. Alive. Breathing. Smiling. And then she wasn't. I keep thinking about how sudden it was. How unfair it was. How someone like her, someone who loved so deeply, who cared so much, could be taken in such a senseless way. I think about her parents, too. About the impossible grief they must carry every single day. Their daughter is gone. Their son is a murderer. What do you even do with that? How do you move forward from something like that? I don't know. I just know that I miss her. And I know I always will. I was born long after it happened, but my mom told me about it every October, right when the air turned crisp and the leaves piled up in damp, rotting heaps along the curbs. It wasn't just a story to her. It was something she lived through, something that left a mark on the town, something that kept parents uneasy when the days grew shorter, when the pumpkins started appearing on porches, and when kids begged to run through the streets in costumes after dark. Back then, my mom's town was the kind of place that barely changed. It was small, the kind of small where everybody knew everybody, where the same families had lived there for generations. People waved when they drove past each other. The main street had a diner, a post office, a grocery store, and a single stoplight. Church was on Sundays, and on Friday nights, the whole town gathered at the high school football field. It wasn't the kind of place where things like this were supposed to happen. Mom was in high school when Nathan Brooks killed his parents. She had known him. Not well, but enough to say hi in the halls, enough to know he wasn't the kind of kid you expected to do something like that. He was a little weird, sure. He had a certain look in his eye, a way of staring too long, but he wasn't an outcast. He had friends, played video games, went to the same parties. No one knew what he was hiding. Nathan's parents had been out of town for a week. They had left him home alone, trusting him like any parent might trust a 17-year-old who seemed responsible enough. But Nathan had other plans. He had spent that week thinking, preparing, letting the idea take root in his mind until it became something he couldn't ignore. When his parents came home, he waited until they were inside. He waited until his dad went to the kitchen and his mom set her purse on the counter. And then he picked up an axe. The first blow came fast. His mother probably didn't even have time to react before the second one came down, splitting through skin and bone. His father must have heard, must have run, but it was too late. Nathan had a gun too. A backup plan. He used it. When it was over, the house must have smelled like iron, the thick metallic scent of blood soaking into the carpet, the walls. But Nathan didn't stop there. He dragged his father's body into the kitchen, set up a punch bowl on the counter, and placed his severed head inside. It was symbolic, maybe. Or maybe he just wanted to see it. The whole time, his younger brother was safe at a friend's house. He had no idea that his home, the place he would come back to, had turned into something unrecognizable. Nathan left him a note. "I'm sorry. It wasn't just guilt. It was a warning, because Nathan had plans. Bigger plans. He had a list, names of people he wanted to kill, dismember, skin. His classmates, his teachers, people who probably never thought twice about him. If they hadn't caught him, he would have done it." The town exploded. The crime scene was worse than anything the local cops had ever seen. They had handled bar fights, maybe the occasional domestic dispute, but nothing like this. News spread faster than wildfire, twisting into something even worse. Rumors started. Nathan was a Satanist. He was in a cult. He had sold his soul to the devil. He had accomplices who were still out there, waiting to finish what he started. People didn't sleep that week. Parents kept their kids inside. Locks that had never been used before were suddenly reinforced. The local churches held prayer circles every night. The sheriff drove down empty streets, checking windows, checking doors. They found Nathan eventually. He was still out there, still thinking about the people on his list. And when they caught him, he didn't cry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He still wanted to kill. The town changed after that. It became quieter, more careful. People stopped trusting so easily. And that year, Halloween was canceled. The mayor made the announcement just days before October 31st. No trick-or-treating, no costumes, no haunted houses. They said it was for safety, that it wasn't the right time for kids to be running around after dark. But everyone knew the real reason. Nathan's story wasn't just something that had happened. It was still happening. People still felt it, still feared it. If he could do that, what about the others? The ones who had been his friends, the ones who might have been just like him? Parents whispered that the cult might still be out there. That Nathan had only been the beginning. No one argued with the mayor. That night, the streets were empty. No kids ran through the neighborhoods. No pumpkins were lit. Just dark houses, blinds shut tight, doors locked. And every year after that, they told the story. To keep the kids from staying out too late. To remind them that sometimes, the real monsters don't wear masks. I don't remember the exact day I met him, but I remember the feeling. It was sometime in the early evening, late fall, one of those overcast days in Seattle when the sky seems permanently gray. I had just finished my last class of the day at the University of Washington's medical school and was walking across campus, my bag heavy with textbooks, my mind exhausted from hours of studying. I was heading toward the parking lot when I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me." I turned. A man stood a few feet away, smiling. He had dark hair, neatly combed, and was dressed well, too well for most students on campus. He was wearing a light-colored sweater over a collared shirt, with dark slacks and polished shoes. Not someone in a rush. Not someone weighed down by books and notes like the rest of us. "I think we might have met before," he said. I hesitated. I didn't recognize him, but there was something about him that felt familiar, like maybe I'd passed him in the hallways before or seen him in the library. UW's campus was big, but in certain circles, you ran into the same people over and over. "Maybe," I said. He smiled wider. "Are you in medicine?" I nodded, still trying to place him. "I thought so. I'm doing my residency here," he said. "Surgery." That caught my interest. I was still early in my studies, but the idea of being a surgeon fascinated me. I had been preparing for this career my entire life. Long nights of studying, stressful exams, endless rotations. And here was someone already in that world, someone who had made it through. We talked for a few minutes, standing there on the sidewalk as students moved around us. He was charming in a quiet way, not overly talkative but engaging. He asked questions about my studies, about what specialty I was interested in, if I was originally from Seattle. When I told him I had grown up here, he nodded like he already knew. "I'd love to keep talking," he said eventually. "Maybe over dinner?" I hesitated. I wasn't sure why. Something about this felt fast, but he seemed nice, and it wasn't uncommon for medical students and residents to date. He was good-looking, well-spoken, confident. There was no reason to say no. "Sure," I said. We exchanged numbers, and that was that. A few nights later, we met at a bar near campus. It was one of those small, dimly lit places where students went to unwind after long days. The kind of place where the floors were always a little sticky, and the smell of beer and old wood hung in the air. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a booth in the back. He stood when he saw me, smiling, and gestured for me to sit. A waiter came almost immediately, and before I could even open the menu, he ordered a bottle of wine. I shook my head. I'm not much of a drinker. But he smiled, waving a hand dismissively. One glass won't hurt. The wine arrived, and he poured for both of us, filling my glass nearly to the brim. I took a sip, more out of politeness than anything else. He asked about my classes, and we talked for a while, but as the conversation went on, something felt off. His answers to my questions about his residency were vague. He mentioned working at the university hospital, but didn't give specifics. When I asked about his rotations, he changed the subject. He kept refilling my glass. Even when I barely drank, he would top it off, making sure it was never empty. I started feeling lightheaded, even though I had eaten before coming. Something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it, but a knot had formed in my stomach. I checked my watch, pretending to be surprised at the time. I should probably get going soon, I said. Early class tomorrow. He didn't protest, but he didn't seem happy about it either. He leaned back in his seat, tilting his head slightly, watching me. You should finish your wine first, he said. I forced a smile and nodded, but didn't take another sip. Instead, I stood. I just need to use the restroom before I go. I turned before he could say anything else, walking toward the back of the restaurant where the restrooms were. But I didn't go in. I kept walking, past the bathrooms, through a side exit that led into an alleyway. As soon as the door shut behind me, I ran. There was another restaurant a block away, one I knew well. A family friend owned it, and I had been there dozens of times. I didn't stop running until I was inside. I must have looked panicked because one of the waiters immediately asked if I was okay. Can I use your phone? I asked, breathless. He nodded and handed it over. My hands were shaking as I dialed my father's number. When he answered, I kept my voice as steady as possible. Dad, can you come pick me up? He could tell something was wrong. I didn't have to say much. I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said. I sat at one of the back tables, facing the door. I kept expecting to see the man from the restaurant walk in, looking for me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. 15 minutes felt like an hour. Then I saw my dad's car pull up. I ran outside, climbed in, and locked the door. As we pulled away, I glanced back toward the bar. He was there, standing on the sidewalk, turning his head left and right like he was looking for someone, like he was looking for me. I didn't say anything. My dad didn't ask questions, not yet. We drove home in silence. Years passed. I finished medical school, moved on with my life. I barely thought about that night. Just another bad date with some guy who had lied to impress me. Then one day the phone rang. It was my dad. Turn on the news. I did. And there he was. The same dark hair. The same smile. The same man. But now they were calling him something else. They were calling him a killer. Ted Bundy. My stomach dropped. I couldn't breathe. I thought back to that night. The way he had watched me. The way he had insisted I drink more. The way he had been looking for me after I ran. I had thought he was just a creep. But he had been a monster. And I had almost been one of his victims. Hashtag. For a long time, I didn't talk about it. I didn't tell my colleagues. I didn't tell my friends. Even now, when I do speak about it, there's a part of me that doesn't believe it really happened. But it did. And sometimes late at night, I still think about what would have happened if I hadn't left through that back door. If I had stayed. If I had finished my wine. I don't like to think about that too much. I don't like to think about that at all. I remember when I first heard about it. It was one of those stories you don't believe at first, because it's too awful, too impossible. I had known their family for years, seen their kids grow up, sat around the same dinner table, heard their laughter. And then suddenly, there was nothing but silence. It was a vacation, a simple trip, something every family does when they need a break from the everyday grind. He had planned it for months, making sure everything was in order. The destination was a small town in Mexico, one of those places tourists don't think about, but where life moves at its own slow rhythm. His wife had family nearby, which made it feel safe, familiar. They weren't strangers to the place. They knew how to move, what areas to avoid, what times of day to stay close to the busy streets. But none of that mattered. They had 3 kids, but it was the youngest who would never come home. The day started like any other on the trip. Warm sun, bright streets, the sound of cars rolling by, distant laughter from people sitting outside small food stalls. They had gone into town to pick up some essentials, nothing special. Just simple things. A pack of bottled water, some snacks for the hotel room, a few small souvenirs for the kids to bring back home. The streets were lined with stores, little shops stacked side by side, each with narrow doors leading into tiny spaces packed with goods. The stores weren't built like the ones back home. Here, they were connected by iron fences that ran in straight lines between them, forming narrow alleys that cut from one street to the other. If you knew where you were going, you could slip through those fences, step into a different part of town, and find yourself on the other side in seconds. That's where he went. The boy was 5, old enough to wander, too young to understand what could happen. Maybe he was curious, maybe he saw something through the fence that caught his eye. Maybe it was just a few seconds of distraction. A mother turning to ask the shopkeeper about a price, a father looking down to check his phone. It doesn't take long. A child sees something interesting and moves toward it. They don't announce their intentions. They don't think about getting lost. By the time they noticed he was missing, he was already gone. At first, they thought he had just stepped into another aisle, hidden behind a shelf. They called his name, expecting to hear a small voice answer back. Nothing. They checked outside, scanning the sidewalk, asking the older kids if they had seen their little brother. No one had. The search became frantic. His father ran up and down the street, calling his name, checking inside every store, every doorway. His mother grabbed strangers by the arm, asking if they had seen a small boy, 5 years old, wearing a red shirt. No one had. 2 hours passed. Panic set in. They went to the police, filling out the report, describing his face, his clothes, his voice. They showed pictures. The officers listened, nodding, writing things down, but there was something in their faces that didn't sit right. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't even concern. It was something else, because they had seen this before. The town wasn't a peaceful place. On the surface, it looked like any other. Small businesses, busy streets, families going about their lives. But just beneath that was something else, something quieter, something that people didn't talk about unless they had to. Cartels. Not the kind you see in movies, not the exaggerated violence and wild shootouts. The real kind. The ones that move in silence, that work in the shadows, that don't need to be loud because their power is understood. And they take people. Sometimes it's rivals. Sometimes it's informants. Sometimes it's kids. The search lasted days. His parents didn't sleep. They barely ate. Every moment was spent looking, asking, waiting for news. Flyers were posted, rewards were offered, anything to bring him home. But in their hearts, they already knew. The police called them in after 3 days. They had found him. Not in town. Not in someone's house. Not waiting to be returned for ransom. They found him in the desert. The heat had already begun to take its toll. His small body had been left out in the open, as if he had been abandoned in a hurry. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just the cruelty of leaving him there alone. They had done something else. At first, his parents couldn't understand what they were hearing. The words didn't make sense. Organs missing. Stomach opened. Not by animals, not by scavengers, but by knives, by hands that knew what they were doing. His small frame had been filled with something that didn't belong there. Packages. Wrapped, taped, sealed tight. Cocaine. He was never meant to be found. He wasn't supposed to be a person anymore. He was supposed to be a delivery. For a customer. The realization broke them. The police tried to explain, as if any explanation could make it better. It was common, they said. Something that happened when a quick, easy method was needed. A child's body could be carried without suspicion, could pass through checkpoints, could be discarded without a second thought if something went wrong. His father collapsed in the station. His mother screamed. 3 years have passed. They still haven't recovered. They never will. People say time heals, but there are things that don't fade. You don't wake up one day and forget that you held your child's hand in a foreign country, walked into a store, and never saw him alive again. You don't forget the feeling of hope crumbling into horror. You don't forget that someone looked at your baby, your smallest, most innocent child, and saw nothing but an empty space to be filled. They left Mexico. They left everything behind. The house, the memories, the reminders. But grief doesn't stay in one place. It follows. It lingers. It creeps into quiet moments, into birthdays that should have been, into Christmas mornings with one less stocking. They have 2 children now, but they used to have 3.